My name is Matthew Gibney. I am 24. I'm a laborer, an artist, and just enjoying life.
St. Julian.
Oh yeah, where I'm from? Hell,
From
St. John. From the kitchen.
Do you define yourself as a St. John?
Yeah. Yes.
John Uema, 53, St. Thomian, and maybe a bit of a St. Johnian. That's my ancestral roots, or part of my ancestral roots. And I'm artist and architect. I'm living in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands.
Monica Marine, I'm 36, visual artist, teacher, curator, and I'm working actually for Public Works on a couple different cultural preservation projects, primarily fundraising to restore some of the historic buildings in the historic sections. And
Where are you from?
I was born in St. Thomas, but I'm Crucian. Grew up on St. Croix.
Eric Miles, 46, born in Puerto Rico, raised in St. Thomas. Families came to St. Thomas 1800s. We're sitting in my great-grandparents' farmhouse. Profession. Formerly filmmaker, photographer, and now executive director of St. Thomas Historical Trust.
I think you're still a filmmaker and
Yes.
photographer, right? Not
Yeah.
formal. Good, thank you. Priscilla Hintz, let's see. How do I define myself? That's kind of tough. Tomio Rican, Criolla, definitely a Virgin Islander with roots in Puerto Rico. Born in Spain, with a continental father and a Puerto Rican mother, so it's kind of very convoluted. But
How old?
42. 42 years old, curator, arts advocate, director of the Pop-Up Art Gallery, as well as RBI Advocates, moderator and facilitator of this event today, and very excited that we're all here together.
David Whitney Knight Sr. I identify as a Virgin Islander, and I'm a historian by profession, but I have had many professions throughout my life in the Virgin Islands. My first real job was a taxi driver on St. John. I moved over to being a boat captain in Sam Gad with the marine industry. Transitioned to, after getting my Coast Guard license, transitioned over to freight and inter-island cargo. Established importation business as a younger person. Had 2 corporations, worked in the construction field. I worked for about 12 years of my life, heavily out of Belém, Brazil, bringing materials from South America in through the Virgin Islands under the Caribbean Basin Initiative. Moved on later in my life after the real disruptions of the Hurricane Hugo and Hurricane Marilyn. I always say that I identify as St. John as my home, but really feel comfortable anywhere in the Virgin Islands. I always think that I really didn't learn St. Thomas until after Hurricane Marilyn, when I worked for SBA for a year as a damage assessment person everywhere. So I'm sorry to ramble on, but it's hard for me to pin down a single profession or identity. But today I consider myself a historian and a cultural resource consultant, and I currently serve by appointment from Governor DeYoung on the Virgin Islands Historic Preservation Commission.
How old?
I'm 64 years old.
You like that question?
I think it's important because it's different spaces that we all went through.
My name is Alan Bryn. I'm a photographer. I was born and raised in the Virgin Islands. I consider myself an islander. I don't really consider myself a Virgin Islander. And my parents are from St. Bart's. My great-grandparents were in St. Bart's in the 1800s, so we're about maybe 3-4 generations from French West Indies. I consider myself an islander, and I actually travel a lot to different islands. We just got back from the Cook Islands, and just to see how much in common we have with people. I've also been to the Seychelles, and the people in the Seychelles, I don't know if you guys know where the Seychelles is, near the Indian Ocean, and they have so much in common with Creole people in the Caribbean. They speak Creole, they actually write it. They speak Patois, and I'm like, how could we be in someplace so far away and we have so much in common? So I consider myself an islander. I don't really consider myself a Virgin Islander. And I did a DNA test. We're talking about Creole specifically. Did a DNA test a couple months back, and DNA test came back 10% non-African, 30% French, 60% Irish. And I just found that interesting because I found a lot of Creole and Frenchies on the island with red hair. So I was like, these people look Irish. So, and the little bit of history research I've done, our people came from Normandy, France. And they actually originally went to Canada, which they thought was too cold, and the group split up into 2 groups. Half of the group went to Louisiana, and I actually see a lot of people in Louisiana that look like the Frenchies that we have in the islands. The other half of the group went to the Caribbean and split up, went to St. Bart's, Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Martin, some of the Virgin Islands. A lot came to the Virgin Islands after World War II because there wasn't much going on in the French islands, not many opportunities because of the war. Everybody was recovering. That's how my parents ended up in the Virgin Islands. Their first home was actually in Savannah, which was Savannah is considered black now, but back when I was a baby, a kid, Savannah was a multicultural neighborhood with all types of people. And it's very interesting how things have just split up on the island where north side, French on Frenchy,
Gentrification.
but it wasn't like that when the island was first, early, 1940s, 50s, 60s. It wasn't like that. So, that's my story.
How old?
I'm 45.
And David will be able to explain to you a little bit more in depth why people in Louisiana look like French here,
Right.
or French West Indies.
Good, good.
So I'm Elisa Lacatina from O'Brien. I am 46. I was St. Tomian, born and raised here. We probably have relatives in common. My family goes back to St. Bart's. My mother's father is a black man from St. Bart's, which I think is unusual because it's not identified as a black island, I think. But both of my grandfathers snuck in here as children, 13 years old, to find a new life, to make money to send home, to raise their families, and I think they did quite well. My father's mother was a local black woman, and my mother's mother was born here, St. Tomian, from Swiss descent. My parents are from St. Bart's, but there's some Swedish blood mixed in as well. And I'm St. Tomian through and through, although we have plenty of family in St. Bart's and Martinique and throughout the Caribbean and in Haiti and Santo Domingo. And so I think it's limiting to identify too clearly or too strongly with a particular area. We're all mixed in together, so I find this project really interesting and exciting, and the topic itself is an important one. So,
Good, thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yep.
Well, I'm David Knight Jr., 28 years old, or 29 years old. I just had a birthday. It's the first time I've said that. I'm a writer. I currently am a reporter for the St. Thomas Source. I've also contributed writing to various regional publications, Art Magazine in Bequia, Caribbean Beat, and Caribbean Review Books, which are based in Trinidad. Grew up between St. Thomas and St. John. St. John is really home. Now live on St. Thomas. I'm of continental heritage. All my family came from the United States. My grandfather worked for public health and bought property on St. John in the 1940s. First started coming down in the 1930s. He was on the opening staff of the Morris de Castro Clinic in Cruz Bay. His wife was first generation of German descent. My mother is from the States. She's a teacher. She moved down here as a teenager. Not the type of person I think that identity issues really occur to her very much. So I don't know what she would say. But I very much identify as a Virgin Islander.
So maybe a couple of thoughts before we go into the Q&A. When you start talking, just for purposes of recording, if you could give your name.
Yeah. I'd like to jump in there, David Knight Sr. Our first tendency was to discuss the term Creole, and we started and then we stopped. So I'd like to pick up on that.
Sure.
Because I think that as many people as we have at this table, or as many people that we could engage in this conversation, that's how many different definitions we're going to have of Creole. Because I think that it is very personalized word. We internalize it. I'd like to throw out at the very outset here that I'm not too sure. And Creole itself, for lack of a better way of explaining it, is a Creole term. Okay? I think you have to be within the context or understand or identify the process of creolization and needing Creole to understand what the word actually means. Okay? And in order for the word Creole to live and breathe and be in common use and be in the lexicon of a community, okay, there has to be a distinct identity that it is linking to. Okay? I'm wondering whether in today's world, the tendency toward globalism, okay, and the breaking down of our cultural distinctions, okay, and particularly in the Virgin Islands, where we are still a colony of America, and the Virgin Islands in my lifetime have gone through such a huge Americanization process that I don't think we can consider anyone born in the Virgin Islands or brought up in the Virgin Islands in today's context. I'm not too sure if you can distinguish them as Creoles as much as you could years before.
Or even
Are they
like the
Creole
British
Americans? Because anyone born in the Virgin Islands today, the American Virgin Islands, is an American, So are we, as a former colony or still a current colony, a part of West Indies where we use the Creole, are we going to continue to identify continentals or Americans born here as Creoles? Somehow I have a hard time with that, because even some of the ones from my generation that I grew up with, if I confront them today and talk to them, they're just Americans, They don't seem to have any real sense of existing within a different culture that they have assimilated with.
They didn't assimilate.
And they didn't assimilate. That's the problem. And if someone didn't assimilate, can we regard them as Creole? So.
Good point. I think that varies, though. I think in being introduced to Annalee's project, I found it quite curious that in the Virgin Islands vocabulary, we don't typically use Creole very often, if at all,
Not as a term of identity.
as a term of identity. I typically use the term criolla in Puerto Rico, that is a very common term to describe, Puerto Ricanos. So I tend to identify with Criolla more than I would White Creole or Virgin Islands Creole or.
What does it mean in Puerto Rico?
Oh,
Creole to you.
Well,
In
Creole,
Puerto-
what is the word? My father told me it meant local, something along the lines of local.
'Cause
Yeah,
I was told that it means that you have African blood in you. Because that's the distinction that my Puerto Rican friends say in Puerto Rico. If you're considered Creole, then you have African blood.
Not necessarily, because criollos who migrated from Spain to Puerto Rico of white descent, who had not mixed, and were born and raised in Puerto Rico, are considered criollos.
Yeah. We can
Yeah.
lay out kind of the history of the term and go with the etymology of it. It's originally, it's from a Portuguese word, and then in Spanish it was criollo, and that's where it first became very widespread in the Spanish Empire from about the 1500s onward. And really it was just a distinction between a settler, somebody of the settler culture born in the new environment, and thus identified with it, and separate somehow from somebody from the metropolitan nation. That definition has been warped and changed in various places. I mean, if you go down to Trinidad, for instance, I think Creole is used as basically anyone who's not East Indian, and I think a lot of East Indians have a problem with the terminology Creole. It's used in so many different, it could be a Creole speaker in certain, countries where there's a Creole language that's separate from the metropolitan language, right? I think we're tending to use it in this conversation for the sake of Annalee Davis. I took a look at who she selected and what the conversation has been. She's using it, I think, as a very, very broad definition of a local, someone who identifies with their immediate surroundings, their immediate cultural surroundings to a way. It's almost more of a form of identity politics, more so than a cultural identity, in the sense that you're differentiating yourself from somebody from the metropolitan nation, the colonial country. For instance, I don't think any of us sitting at this table necessarily, if we were in the United States, would say that we were Americans, and we want to qualify that in some way, even though we've been U.S. citizens for our entire lives, I think all of us.
I don't consider myself American.
Right.
In any way, shape, or form.
I have
That's one
my,
of the questions.
Remember when you're speaking to say who you are first, so
Yeah,
the recorder can pick that up.
Sorry.
This is Elisa, and interestingly enough, my mother's sister is married to my father's brother, so their children are virtually my brothers and sisters. However, they were raised in Texas, and what I'm finding interesting is that we get to choose at a certain level whether or not we identify ourselves as Creole, because same bloodline, same DNA, but they were raised in America, and I don't think any of them would call themselves Creole. They would call themselves Texans or Americans, and conversely, my brothers and sister and I clearly identify with Creole, and it's kind of who, we choose that, and I don't think anybody can tell us that we're not allowed to make that choice. So,
Moments in time, John Uema, moments in time, from what I was researching, you have the colonial term of Creole, which probably the most important part of that was reliance by the colonizer. They were the people in favor, and it really was a white term at that point. Then in the post-colonial, it became the Creolization struggle. And in the modern world, the assimilation of other colonies even, or modernization process, and then post-modern could be enigmatic in a way, particularly when you look at individual island nations in terms of carrying on the knowledge of that place. And then you have the individualistic, choice of the white Creole, especially in an African, amidst an African kind of culture, and that really has to do a lot with, I think, how we were auto-domesticated. The family structure that you were brought up in terms of understanding place, the mix, and so those are some things that kind of like I used as my platform to kind of understand the process, because I agree with David Sr. that it moves around a lot, you know, and it's moments in time and it's moments in family. You know, families split, travel, assimilate. You know, now our mother country is American. There's a lot of things that happen in the diaspora, but intrinsically with the Creole thing, I think, and if you were domesticated in an astute way, I think there's perhaps a uniting common thread in the diaspora that, or even inter-island to that effect. Once you have been raised that way, there's an immediate connection with other people, particularly in the diaspora, because people in the diaspora can feel exiled from their own, you know, identity even, you know, particularly in America. So I just wanted to add that in there while we're getting into the base definition.
Yeah, and David Mancini. John, I think you're correct, and you say that a lot of it has to do with individual family, and it does very much so, because within family and broader social groups, you know, they have interacted to one degree or more with the local culture and the local community that has made them assimilate or pick up on that more. I mean, you could be brought up behind the gates at Peter Bay or Water Point on St. Thomas or over at the Anchorage and never go outside the gates and go to Antilles School and grow up being a total American in the Virgin Islands, you know, or you can have a different context, you know. But the other thing that I just wanted to say is that it's not just immediate family and social surroundings, it's
The village.
geographic.
Yeah.
The village.
Yeah, it's the village, it's geographic, because I'm sure that there's experiences that Matthew and I can relate to, okay, that are specific to the St. John context, okay?
And probably the white St. John context.
And yeah, I mean, I think we know who we are, you know? And that experience, you know, particularly for myself growing up in the 50s, okay, is a very different experience to St. Thomas experience in the same period, where St. Thomas has always been a very cosmopolitan place, where we were so much more insulated on St. John. So it's very specific.
This might be a good time to get into the next question, Priscilla, that you have in front of you, because I think we're asking, do you identify with the term white Creole? And it is, I think if I'm not mistaken, I have the paper in front of me, but it asks about cultural identification. And what David Sr. is saying, it sounds to me like, and I would agree.
Yeah, race, class, nationality. I think that's a great thing to go around and have everybody, you know, answer, because
It would answer the first question in.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just go ahead and Bree?
Hold on.
Yeah, go ahead.
What it sounds like David Sr. is saying is that there's multiple communities within the Virgin Islands, which is something that.
And most Creole societies.
We're a very small population too, so we have that really complicating our dynamic here in the way that people choose to identify. Is that there are ways you can grow up in the Virgin Islands or be in the Virgin Islands, and you're still a Virgin Islander by virtue of being from there, but you have a whole different experience based on island, based on ethnicity, based on.
well, you know, it was in the post-colonial experience that the Africans were included in that colonial definition, and there lies the struggle, you know, because just within the African variegation of you know, there's 128 or something, you know, different types of blackness, and there's like, you know, pretty much one or two different types of whiteness.
Well,
and
that's the perception.
that was the introduction, from what I've read, of when the black Creole, or, you know, the inclusion of the black Creole in the definition. And, you know, that wouldn't have happened in the white Creole experience, because a matter of privilege and a matter of reliance was, you know, towards the white connection. Even it might have been diffused by an African interracial mixing at that point, but it still had you know, a level of privilege that was assimilated. And then there's some really distinct things that white polarizations that happen in the Virgin Islands, which I wrote down and I would love to go into later in terms of the continental influx and the gravitation towards, look, language, whatever you want to call it. So.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and start with question number 1 and maybe just go around the table. If you choose to answer, great, and if not, just say pass. Oh, you don't have the question? All right, yeah. So question number 1, how do you define yourself in terms of race, class, and nationality? Do you identify with the term white Creole? How far back can you trace your family on maternal and paternal lines?
Just go around there.
Okay, Matthew Gibney. In terms of race, I define myself as a white person because, it's silly classifications to me anyways, but my skin is white, so I'm Caucasian, okay? As a class, I would say middle class because my family doesn't have money, but we have land, and so there is definitely an aspect of privilege there. Nationality, I would say Virgin Islander. I don't identify with the United States simply because I'm kind of resentful of the way the culture has swallowed everything around it, just on basic level. White Creole, I don't really identify with the term white Creole. I don't really particularly see myself as Creole. My mother and my father are both from my father is from the Virgin Islands, but both of my lines go back to the States and the East Coast. My mother is from South Texas, Louisiana, Kansas. My father is from New York, Northeast. My father's parents bought land in the 30s or something on St. John, and my father had a back and forth life between New York and St. John. He was born on St. Thomas. My parents' generation, my uncle and my aunts, they assimilated in a certain way, but because of their proximity to the continental United States and the privileges of my grandparents' money and everything, there was a distance that they were able to retain. Like my father can speak with accent when he wants to, but for the most part he doesn't. He will when he's talking with a West Indian, or a black person, but beyond that, doesn't really use it. My mother asked me when I was like 15 whether I was going to be a white person or a black person, whether I was going to be a statesider or a West Indian. I was like, well, that's an easy decision. I'm definitely not a statesider. So, but my brother, who we grew up in the same household and basically the same experience, just a difference of 3 years, he left at 18 and never came back. He has no desire to at all. And so he really polarized the opposite direction and identified with his continental roots, where these are my friends, these are the people I've always known, and this is my home, so.
That's a really interesting point there, man.
It's just like, and to answer the first question a little more, what is Creole, like David Sr. said, you can almost not call people in the Virgin Islands just because of globalization in general, industrialization of commodification of goods and everything, the ease in which we can get a car, air conditioning, and fish from the store, and everybody's culture is disappearing. The term Creole was, we fished, we farmed, we did these things, they were our lifestyle because we had to do them. Because if we didn't do them, we didn't eat. Nowadays, you can get away with doing whatever you want, and so that's why I don't identify with the term white Creole, but I don't really identify with
Anything else?
anything really particularly.
Good, thank you, Matthew.
That's great. Johnny Lima. I consider myself to be mixed race, and I guess on forms I'm other, privileged class. Nationality, I would say I'm abandoned. I guess U.S. guilty by association. And, but with that, a certain privilege. I travel a lot. I've been to, like over 70 countries, and the U.S. entree in terms of visas and accessibility has offered me, that. So I'm kind of privileged within the abandoned nationality. We don't have an island nationality because of our milieu and because of the inheritance of the U.S. of a colonial mentality. I think that, and then confounded by the type of slavery that we had, which was unique in the world, versus being conquered and having a stewardship of the land. White Creole definition, I think that it's just non-existent in the Virgin Islands. And I had a client who looks very much Creole, but comes from a proud black family in the United States. So who in the U.S. could pass as Creole, and asked me a perplexing question a couple of years ago, and asked me, "What are you?" And perplexed, I answered as that kind of ethnic citizen of the world, and she replied, "Well, that sounds Creole." And I replied that you're right, but we don't use that term in the Virgin Islands. And a great mix. Come from a great lineage, 7th-generation Virgin Islander on my mother's side, mixed European black and Latin, Spanish. On my father's side, purebred Northern Holland, 7 generations. They own a crest seal for the family. And that creates a uniqueness that I think is not heralded by the current, or maybe just never really heralded, because of the post-colonial. When you look at the privilege of being the white Creole, and then the abandonment of that suddenly in the divestment of the colonial construct, really does leave you feeling pretty abandoned, and then the lack of the nationality and so forth. That's my answer.
Thank you, Elena.
This is Monica Marine, and I would consider myself white Caribbean. My parents actually are both from the States. They moved to St. Thomas when they were about 22, fresh out of college, wanting to give back through teaching. So my mom's 35-year retired public school teacher. Both of them lifelong educators. So grew up pretty poor, but my mother was considered mixed in the States because her mother was Maltese, father was British, so they grew up in Detroit as, they were both nickel immigrants. And she did not want to have that experience of she just thought she didn't want to raise her family in suburbia, racist America. So they moved down here, and definitely I feel like I grew up fully immersed in the culture. So I wouldn't consider myself white Creole, just because I think, like kind of how John said it, we don't really use that word. So I wouldn't self-identify along those lines, but I definitely don't really strongly identify with being American. That was not my experience.
Thanks, Monica.
Eric Miles. In terms of Creole as a definition, to me it just is a very broad sense of the word of the Caribbean, is how I would consider a Creole. In truth, I hadn't really considered being Creole or white Creole, because as everyone has already said, it's not a term commonly used here. You go to the Spanish islands, you go to the French islands, and it's used all the time, French Creole, Spanish Creole in the cooking and everything. And we just don't, it's just not something that's used as an identifier here, or even in any common day language. So, but I'm aware of it now. And that just happened earlier this year, because it suddenly struck me in a conversation with Philip Sturm. talking about what is Creole, and then I was like, well, you're Creole. I'm like, oh. Really? He's like, yeah. So I'm like, oh, I guess it sums up nicely the definition, but how you feel. Coming from a Danish West Indian heritage, Dings are always sort of left on the periphery of everything. They're not a big group, and they certainly get left out of a lot of things. So tracing back maternal or paternal lines, my great-grandfather, Rasmus Johansen, came here as the chief engineer with the West Indian Company after the hurricanes and the earthquakes and tsunamis of 1967, and was part of the big...
1867, correct?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, 1867,
1867.
yeah.
Just for the record.
Yes. What did I say?
You said 19.
19.
And I always do that. In 1867. And he... so he's part of the fixing of the infrastructure, and was the chief engineer, built the West Indian Company dock, continued on as a blacksmith, started the power company for the West Indian Company, which also supplied a lot of town. Went with the power company, got transferred to Public Works, and he moved over to Public Works here. This was their home. He farmed, he was an avid farmer as well, and he worked as a blacksmith out of the bottom of the hill here. So, and I still hold the farming license. But,
What do you grow?
yeah.
Tax breaks.
I grow things. I grow things to feed iguanas. Is what I do now. You plant a whole field, and it'll be like 3 days great. It's beautiful. It's coming up, and then in 1 day, I don't know why they all decide at the same time to eat everything you've got, and it's gone. But tracing back my family lines, as far as I can go back on my mother's side, she was Armenian Gypsy. My grandfather's mother came to Denmark. And on my father's side, goes to the Ramsden family, Lord Ramsden, and someone was a servant girl in the manor house, but he actually ended up marrying her. But at that time of his death, you couldn't transfer anything to a lady. So both sides have Gypsy in them. So I guess you go back all the way to India. It's pretty well traced, and 500 years stuck in a desert in North Africa, and we're here. So I guess this could take a long time, so I'm just going to leave it at that. As far as identity with America, it's sort of always been a contentious thing for me, because I've always considered that, or painfully been aware that America doesn't really consider us to be American, and it rang through extremely clearly for me last year. I was, my credit card had been hacked, and they wouldn't give me my information over the phone because I'm not American. And I'm like, well, I thought I was. But, yeah, you are, but yeah, not really. So that's sort of how
I'll give you a lip service.
that's how I sort of apply everything that we have to do with being American. Like, yeah, you are, but not really.
No Obamacare for you.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, not.
As John said, we're abandoned.
Abandoned.
We're black. In America's eyes, that's what it is.
We're a colony.
And I wanted
It's
to
true.
remark on your lineage, your DNA test, Alan. A lot of people have done this test recently, and I've heard all the results. I haven't done it myself, but it seems that like 10% African American is a common figure that I hear out of
Everybody.
everyone's test that I've heard so far.
10%
Because we all came
North-
from a-
No, African, not
North
African.
I'm sorry,
American.
just-
Yeah,
yeah,
just
African,
African.
you're right.
North African.
African.
And I think a big part because of that, there was a lot of travel back in the days. We, from what the Normandy, France were the first biggest boat builders, and they used to make boats. I think they traveled to places like Morocco.
Yeah, it's Mediterranean.
Right.
Yeah,
Seafaring culture.
But you know, that gets into different thing, which Monica has some great dialogue on too about the one drop rule. And I think with the DNA test, 13% is the tipping point where you're considered black. You know, which is kind of interesting. You would think it would be a higher thing, but you know, I'm currently doing it because of a friend that had made some incredible discoveries with his grandmother, who was who I grew up with knowing as the last Caribbean descendant living in the Virgin Islands.
Oh, wow.
And after her death, found out that she had a child out of wedlock. She married the brother of the Jewish rabbi, and then discovered that she doesn't have one drop of Amerindian or Caribbean blood, and that actually goes back to a mix of Africa and indentured service East India. And he felt lied to. I found it kind of comical because I always bragged that I knew, you know, she was like a second grandmother to me. So, you know, Granny, she's a Caribbean, and, you know, tell me what it was like, you know, making arrowheads. And then, you know, he felt really gypped though on it, and I found a humor in it. But then I realized that maybe she didn't lie. Maybe she didn't lie. Maybe she was lied to be able to assimilate into a very close Jewish society here and marry the rabbi's brother, who was a little bit of a radical, you know, in terms of you know, Sasso family was a big split in terms of conservative to you know, just wild man. But I just found that very interesting as to where was the lie? Where was the lie? You know, and it probably came from that post-colonial struggle of, you know, the black
I don't know
Creole.
if you can call it a lie, you know, because
Or just a story.
Yeah,
It's the story.
It's all a
it's a
mythology.
story,
Right.
and you know there is pressure in our society to identify yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't look like most other people,
Right, you lie.
if you have facial features and you look in the mirror and you think, or people say, "Oh, you're an Indio," you know, well, maybe that's how I explain myself.
I would say a lot of the slave master, you know, white colonial settlers would lie about their mixed breed children. You're not half white, you're half Indian, dude. That's not, you're not, you know. That's not my child. That's you didn't see the Indian running through the bush over there, you know, like that kind of thing.
Well, that gets into a different question, but that's not to.
I just wanted to end up, but in the 100 years plus here, my family has managed to kind of spread out quite a lot. I have a lot of family, and they are on all the islands, St. Bart's, French, Spanish, Puerto Rican, Black, right? I mean, it's 100 years is a relatively short amount of time, but to be able to assimilate into all those different, so I get to see all, I feel privileged that I was at a vantage point where I can sort of see or relate to all these different.
So you consider a lot of miles. A lot of miles in the Miles family.
Thanks, Eric. Priscilla Hints. I always resented having to check off race. I always consider myself, for the most part, Latina, Hispanic, Virgin Islander. So I don't know. That's not necessarily
They don't have
a
that
race.
category.
They don't have that category. So, but you know.
What race are you?
Told every day, for the most part, if I say that I'm from the Virgin Islands or Puerto Riqueña, they're like, but you're so white. So I'm reminded constantly of my whiteness, which is fine. And I feel, you know, a lot, I do acknowledge that with the color of my skin, I am afforded a considerable amount of privilege because people perceive based on what
In
they
the
see.
islands or in America?
I think both. Both.
These are questions we can explore.
Yeah.
There's another.
Yeah. So, middle class. My father migrated to the Caribbean in the early 60s. He's second generation German. Farmer. Worked on the farm and was a preacher, a minister, Church of Christ, very Bible beating. Was sent to Jamaica to convert the Jamaicans. And like we like to say, rather than he converting the Jamaicans converted him. So if you ask him today, he has lived most of his life, about 80% of his life. He's 83 now, and came to the Caribbean in his 20s as a Caribbean man. He started out in Jamaica, then migrated to the Virgin Islands in the mid-60s. Met a Puerto Riqueña, my mother, here in the Virgin Islands.
At the Virgin Islands Hotel.
At the Virgin Islands Hotel on a blind date. And he moved here to work on a farm very close to this property here in Old Tutu, the Hartman Farm. And then was sent to work for a larger international company after he married my mother in Puerto Rico, to Cuba, and then on to Europe. And that's kind of where I ended up landing, being born in Spain. I like being able to say that I was born in Spain. I think it's fun, it's different, but I didn't grow up there. I'm not Spaniard. I do speak Spanish, but for me it's more Criolla Spanish from Puerto Rico. That was what I was raised on. That was my first language. And of course, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands being a colony of the United States. I mean, I have a U.S. passport. I've gone to school in the continental United States. But on a number of occasions, living, working, and studying briefly in the continental United States, I never felt like I belonged. You know, I remember my first experience at Emerson College, and had two very American, roommates, and just had a really hard time relating. So I ended up joining like the international club, the African American club, the Latino club, just to feel a little bit more like I belonged. So I struggle with identity a lot, especially when I'm in the States. I feel more uncomfortable in my own skin, oddly enough, up there than I do here in Puerto Rico or anywhere in the Caribbean region. So, again, as I mentioned, white Creole nationality. I'm American, but I feel Caribbean. I mean, Caribbean isn't a nationality per se, but I feel, bi-island. I tell people I'm, from St. Thomas and Puerto Rico. So to me, that is my nationality. As I mentioned earlier, white Creole, again, that's not a term that we here in the Virgin Islands use. So I've always identified more with the word criolla, because it is commonly used in Puerto Rico, from everything from the language to the food to the culture. My mother, Puerto Riqueña, with Spanish and Italian heritage. She was raised by her adopted father, who is of African descent. He could trace his family lineage to the Dominican Republic. So it's a good mix. I think that's it for me.
Okay, David Knight Sr. A lot of what I could say at this point is redundant, because pretty much everybody's expressed the same thing. Race, I guess I have to consider myself white, with Northern European heritage on both my parental sides. My nightline goes back to England and Ireland, but are Yankees from the beginning.
Bubbleheads.
Yeah, they're class. I guess I have always considered myself to be middle class, although I don't know if that class even exists anymore. So I feel pretty poor myself right now. Nationality. I think one of the commonalities that we're coming down to at this table is that most of us, so far at least, are pretty adamant that we really don't identify as United States Americans, although we carry U.S. passports. If we're going through customs and people ask us our nationality, we're going to say USA. I don't think I've ever really identified with being American
A Yankee?
Totally.
That term in and of itself
at any
is
point
so
in my
confusing.
life, and don't plan to, you know. Generally, even though I can go back to New England where I have a lot of family heritage, I can look around and say, oh yeah, well, this, you know, I got family heritage here, this is all kind of familiar, but I'm a fish out of water. I feel much more comfortable pretty much anywhere in the Caribbean and Latin America than I do in the United States. As a young person, I gravitated a lot toward Latin America and the rest of the Caribbean. And I've always felt comfortable within that context. So, you know, I like Mr. Brent's term, you know, Islander. I think Islander works really good for me as well too. Because I can go to other islands in the world, places like Cornwall in the middle of the Baltic, and feel pretty comfortable.
Right, right. Well, we have a lot of intrinsic psychology
Yeah,
there
sure.
with the
I mean,
island.
I think that's a commonality.
Island people are cool.
And we all kind of look for commonality. If we're looking for identity and commonality, Islander's a good one. If you press me on a concept of individual nationalism, I'd have to say Virgin Island.
Do you think that exists? Do you think a national identity of Virgin Islander exists?
Next question.
Okay,
You know,
all right, all right.
I think we can,
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
we
okay,
can
okay.
individually decide that. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Whether it is a nation or not, that's a big discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that question was covered.
I do not, absolutely do not identify with the term white Creole. Never have. Wouldn't even consider it, quite honestly, because I don't believe the term Creole should have an identifier, a racial identifier attached to it, because I think, I know who Creoles are, you know. And even though we haven't used that term historically in the Virgin Islands, although in the Danish period it was certainly used. I mean,
Right.
you know, Oldendorp back in the 1750s uses the term and defines it within the Danish West Indies. So it is a term that is used, but it's a colonial term,
How did you
and
define it?
it's a term that you know, contextualizing within a colonial context. You know.
How did Oldendorp define it? You know, off the top of your head. What was his
Yeah,
definition?
he basically says that it was used in the 18th century in the Danish West Indies as anything that is actually born there. Like you could have Creole cattle, or Creole dogs, or Creole sheep, or you know, you could have a Creole African slave. You could have you know, John Lorenz Carstensen, you know, who was one of the big planters and promoters of the Moravian religion in the islands, who had Dutch and Danish heritage, was a Creole by virtue of the fact that he had been born on St. Thomas.
And the colonial experience
spent-
didn't happen only in the Caribbean,
Yeah.
you know, so you've got Indonesian Creoles and
Yeah.
other things.
But he uses it just in the context of the Danish West Indies. And I think that, you know, to me, growing up, I may not have identified with the term Creole because I saw it used more often in context of the French communities, okay? And anywhere there was French heritage, Dominica, the term is used, okay? And they're French Maton speaking, you know? And Martinique, the term is used. To me, if you ask me to identify a white Creole society within the Virgin Islands context, the only one I could really identify would be the French community. To me, is a white Creole society within the Virgin Islands.
Right.
And, you know, because they are generally identified as white, okay? Even though,
They have racial component.
hey, let's face it, at this point in world history, we are all mixed,
Absolutely.
you know? So this is why I think these identifiers, like putting white in front of the term like Creole, just doesn't hold water to me at all. And I also think that when you talk about Creole, it has to be hinged to and relate to a particular cultural group or entity that is distinguishable. And the French community, the so-called Frenchy community
right, Frenchy.
within our context, is an identifiable community. Other white communities that I can identify throughout the white Creole societies that I would identify throughout the Virgin Islands or throughout the West Indies would be like Saba. The island of Saba is largely a white Creole society.
Right.
Okay. There's pockets of it in some of the other Dutch islands. There's pockets of it in the French islands. I think within the colonial period where your major landowners on islands like Barbados and so on. You know, it's interesting that when Annalee Davis spoke, she spoke of the planter class in the colonial context in Barbados as a white class, okay? So you can have white Creoles in that context. In the Danish West Indies, that broke down very quickly because by the time of emancipation, on St. John is the only one I've actually done the statistics for, but we had 38 to 40% of the property plantation owners on St. John at emancipation were of the free colored community, and you can't say that that was a white social group, you know? So I think that
That's a good point.
that
a good
broke
point.
down in these islands sooner than in other places that have upheld it. And I also think that in the British West Indies, they retained that distinction because they have reached a point of individual nationalism. They have become nations themselves, and within their nations, they still have ancestors of that white
Not all
planter
of them are true, not all of them are true.
class, most of it, okay?
So there's
Some
But
islands are
still, in
very
Jamaica,
strong.
when you still look in Jamaica, you have
Yeah.
a white.
But we don't necessarily have those descendants so much here in the Virgin Islands. Not that we can
Too small.
absolutely just look at and say, white planter class descendants. Everybody mixed them, they look pretty good here. So I don't identify with the term white group.
To a point.
Yeah,
To a point.
I think.
To a point.
To a point.
Well,
You know.
yeah, I mean, but see, then we have our micro distinctions, you know. Then we really start to talk about our own specific individual experience as descendants of Danish West Indies or Virgin Islanders, you know, that it becomes class, not race, okay? Because things divided down social lines rather than racial lines.
More like a proximity to whiteness, scales of gray rather than black and white.
Yeah, there's
It's
one
okay.
unfortunately.
And just,
Yeah, that's in another, that's in another.
I'll just wrap up quickly about tracking my maternal and paternal lines. My father was definitely a Yankee, you know, and I identify from his side of the family as being a real Yankee heritage. And my mother was a pure German heritage. As far as tracking those lines back, my paternal side, we have always had genealogists in the family. And we have kept our genealogical documents back to the 1500s. We still have documents tracing our family all the way back to at least that point. At least within a generation before they came to America in the 1500s or earlier. My mother's side's a little more problematic because she was pure German. And it's interesting that my mother felt very comfortable in St. Thomas pre-World War II because of she had a Danish family, Danish, German, Polish family, and so on. And there was enough of the old Danish and German expatriates and so on community within St. Thomas that she commented on how she felt more comfortable within that society here. And actually had been here when World War II, when America entered World War II and was hesitant to go back to America and stayed in the islands for a long period of time before it was determined, before she had confidence that she wouldn't be persecuted as a German when she went back to the United States. But as far as tracing her line, it's interesting because her people basically left Germany around the World War I or post-World War I period. Okay? And she was a young person in the United States and here when the World War II broke out. But she never talked about her genealogy. And being an American German, growing up in that context of world wars, she never spoke about her Germanness. Although she held Germanness, cooked German food, the family still spoke German to some degree with each other's, but they didn't talk about it. Okay? And it wasn't until after she died that I actually found that she had kept a genealogical scrapbook that had her family genealogy in Germany and Poland, going all the way back into the 1700s. And I just thought that was so amazing because my mother never talked about her family, and yet and there were photographs. She had photographs of her grandparents parents and great parents, and the towns in Germany where they lived, and the areas of Poland where they lived. And there was this beautiful little genealogy that was with them that went back 5 generations and had been done in the early 30s by one of her family in Germany. And I had a visitor. I was working with German public TV on a special they were doing on the Danish West Indies here. And I was talking to the producer, who was a German, and I said, oh, I have this wonderful family genealogy. Let me show it to you, tell you about it. And he looked at it and he said, well, you know what that is? He says, everyone in Germany in the Nazi period had to produce documents proving that they were pure German back 5 generations. You know? Or they couldn't, or they would have been persecuted, couldn't be part of the Nazi Party in Germany. And that document, I realized, was done for that purpose.
Wow, that's really interesting.
So, can you trust it?
No.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Certainly,
anyway.
Good
certainly a
start.
motivator behind
Yeah.
actually finding.
Thank you. Night senior. Alan.
You mentioned earlier that Creole is a Spanish word. Okay, it's funny you mentioned
Portuguese, actually, by origin.
Introduce your name, Alan.
Alan Brin. The French left, my ancestors left France because they were being persecuted by the Spanish at that time. Wouldn't it be ironic that the word Creole would refer to those people who left? Because for me, you know, I'm listening to all these new terms of Creole. Creole for me is French influence, period. No questions asked. So all these other terms I'm hearing is like brand new. It's like when we grew up, my parents would say, you're gonna meet so-and-so from this place. And they would say, let's say Martinique. They referred to the place they were from originally, and then they would say they were Creole, which meant that they were French influenced, whether they were black, mixed, or white, referred to the fact that they were French influenced. So the term white Creole means nothing to me. Zero, zip, nada. The word Creole means French influence to me, and yes, I would identify myself as being Creole. But Creole is an inside word. It's like, I would feel a little uncomfortable with an American going, hey, are you Creole? And I would feel fun with an islander saying he's Creole. So it's, right.
Keep that word out your mouth.
Right, so I just, to me, it's an insider word to identify that you're not just an islander, but you're a particular type of islander. And that's my definition of the word. So, that's it.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Elisa, and I can't see this because I didn't bring my glasses, but I don't know that I can identify.
Does help?
Let's see. Oh yes, thank you. I don't know if I can identify as white Creole. That sounds so limiting and confined. I mean, half of my history is black, and I look, obviously I look very white, but my grandfather was as black as could be, so I don't know why I have to define that. I don't like being limited by that term, although I wholeheartedly agree with Alan that we may have the right to use that word, and if you stateside continentals may not fully grasp the meaning, which leads me to think too that listening to everybody here, Creole may not necessarily be a nationality. We're Spanish, we're French, we're Danish, we're all these things, but it's more of an experience. And maybe part of that experience is the isolationist from America and from other parts of Europe, that feet in the ground, feet in the water, living on an island and sustaining yourself separately as an experience. I wonder how that plays in to the term being Creole more than what nation your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent came from, you know. So, you know, I said before that, you know, my family dates back to St. Bart's and primarily, but to other islands in the Caribbean. And I think that we, more so when we were children, thank you, when we were younger, we would have been lower middle class, and maybe, if it's possible, we would have been more Creole when we were children and more isolated. Economically and culturally and socially. There was no internet, you know, and that, I think that openness to the rest of the world probably plays into blurring the line some. You know, my son is 100% Creole as well, but he's experiencing, if being Creole is an experience, he's experiencing it with one foot in another part of the world more than I did. And I think, does it make him less Creole? I don't think so, but like I said, my cousins of the same genetics were fully experiencing another part of the world. So are they less Creole, or is it their experience or lack of a particular experience that denies them the right to call themselves that?
Creole
So,
experience.
no, it's an experience to me.
Good.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, this is David Knight Jr. To the questions here. How do you define yourself in terms of race, class, and nationality? In terms of race, I have to say that I'm white. The problem with that, I think, and maybe Matthew would agree in talking about that, is we grew up at a certain time on St. John, which has seen kind of an influx of white people from a culture that we don't recognize as our own, having grown up on St. John and having generational heritage.
A metamorphosis, actually, into a
so-
white place.
So that's why it becomes a problem. Yeah, that's why it becomes a
Isolated
problem.
white community.
Certainly my family's always been identified as white on St. John throughout the time there. But it becomes a problem for me to say that unproblematically, given if you say you're a white person from St. John, people have a certain mindset of what that means. And there's certainly,
Yeah.
the majority of white people
White
on
on St. John
I
doesn't
don't,
mean
I don't,
Creole any at all.
yeah, and I certainly don't relate to most of it. In fact, I live on St. Thomas now, and that's one of the reasons why I do, because I find it very hard to live on St. John. as a
Hip hop
white person.
versus granola.
Pretty much.
Class, grew up middle class. I have an interesting experience there, I think, because my parents are divorced. I grew up in my mother's house primarily, Bordeaux Mountain, on St. John, which is kind of in the bush. It's country, it's rural, especially during that time. And then I grew up also coming back and forth to St. Thomas, where my father, David Knight Sr., lived, and he was living with my stepmother in her plantation great house, her mother's house, which is a state and cement in Holday. It's the old Holday plantation house. And I think that had a profound effect on me growing up in that environment, especially at a time when my father was studying history and we were living on a historical property.
In the middle of Frenchie.
In the middle, yep, in Frenchy territory on the north side. But certainly, I don't relate to my experience growing up on St. Thomas. I didn't feel too integrated into a community on St. Thomas. I was here. I did go to school here 1 year at Antilles, but all my other school time was on St. John, and certainly that's where I always felt was home and still do. I'm just starting to become a little more integrated on St. Thomas. I've been here for a year now and working for the school.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you. I enjoy it very much. I love St. Thomas. But yeah, no, St. John, coming from St. John can be a very painful experience. We have a couple St. John people here, so maybe we'll talk more about that. And I feel that we've lost sort of a Creole experience to a huge degree. And it was already diluted by the time I was coming up, but it seems to me now totally non-existent. As somebody who also substitute, my mother is the head of the lower campus in the Gibto School on St. John. Sometimes I substitute teach there. And I can't imagine seeing some of the kids growing up, how they're going to relate or what they're going to relate to as a group growing up on St. John now. Who knows if it seems to detach from the rest of the Virgin Islands. Certainly, I identify myself as a Virgin Islander. I'm comfortable on St. Thomas, St. Croix, Tortola, wherever the case may be. Nationality, I guess I just answered that when pressed to identify as a Virgin Islander, definitely. I do believe it is a nation and a national identity. It's a very fragmented and segmented one. We'll get to that later. I would not identify as myself as American unless pressed on like official documents to do so. Even though I'm uncomfortable with it, like if I have to fill out customs, when I was recently traveling around South America, people would, ask me, where are you from? Fill this in document with your nationality at borders and things like that, and I would have to put USA, but I felt very uncomfortable doing so because I certainly don't identify as American. Do you identify with the term white Creole? Yes and no. I would say that the reason why I might have a stronger identification with that than most people are saying they do is because I was introduced to the term when I was in college. I kind of instinctually identified with the term even in high school, but then when I really found out, when I encountered other people who were using the term, it was in college when I began my writing career, and I was meeting other people who were running publications in the Caribbean. A lot of people, a lot of artists and writers were identifying with that term, white Creole. I think it all has a lot to do with one of the kind of formative texts of Caribbean literature written by Jean Rees, the writer from Dominica, who is seen as a white Creole writer. And I think a lot of people, when they read that book, if they're identified as white in the Caribbean and they read that, they'll say, oh, this is in some way my experience. That was my experience of reading that book. And I think people kind of, I think it's a form of identity politics, like I said, in my mind, and in the way that I encounter people throughout the Caribbean using it, and the people I interact with through writing. And it's almost to identify yourself away from the expatriate experience. It's a form of saying that's essentially not what I am if you're white. And it's also a form, I think the reason why white is put in front of it is because Caribbean societies do still struggle with racism. So you do have a particular experience of the Caribbean as a white person. You have an experience of a certain amount of privilege, but you also have a certain amount of, in some cases, kind of segregation or resistance by the broader community. If you're living in a broader African society, St. Thomas is a little bit different because it was very cosmopolitan. St. John certainly is traditionally a black island. You feel a bit separate from the broader majority. And I think that's why Annalee, for instance, is including white Creole. It's the reason why I think it's valid to put white in front, because there is still a distinctive racial experience of the Caribbean. And certainly, speaking personally from my own identity, as David Sr. said, my heritage, my Yankee heritage there is about as white as it comes. German and English, for generations and generations, those people married each other. So there's nothing within the American context exotic about my background at all. It's very.
But the experience
and French on your mother's side.
And yeah, French, and her mother grew up in Bermuda, so she's an island person as well. But yeah, I do see it as being. I think it's a term that has some validity in broader international discussions. We don't use the term here. I don't go around saying, identifying with the term here at all. Impressed in the Virgin Islands, I wouldn't use the term. But in a broader context, for instance, being invited to participate in this, I think, I would think that a lot of people around this table would identify with the term just based on their experience here, whether they use it in common.
Or deconstruct the term.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking about it. That's what we're trying to figure out what people think about
I
it.
think Elisa's right in terms of the experience. I mean, I know the experience that your dad, for instance, grew up with in St. John, and I would say, just outside the definition, that was a Creole experience, and then how you were raised, right, and domesticated, you had a bit of that Creole experience as well, especially living in a nature island, isolated island in St. John, right? So it does kind of come down to an experience, I think that's a fair thing to say, especially now we made it around the table, and I guess those are the things when I travel to other places, particularly the French islands, right? I'm accepted as a Creole person because I had that same experience. But had I been living outside of that experience here, I don't think I could purport that or would have that as part of me to introduce myself or to meet or just asking questions or it's in a different way. It's in a different way as than you would if you were devoid of that experience.
Good. I think for purposes of time, maybe we could marry the next two questions so that as we go around the table, answer both of the two questions. So number 2, is there such a thing as white Creole Virgin Islands culture or local white Creole culture? I think we've talked a little bit about that. What does it mean to be white in your local context in terms of family, wider social or professional circles? Would you say that the Virgin Islands operates as a racially ordered, segmented society, or is it an integrated space? Can you speak to what you think binds Virgin Islands society together? Is there a national identity that supersedes a racial identity? And number 3, what did your primary school experience look and feel like racially? What did your secondary or tertiary level experience look and feel like in racial terms? Do you remember anything about the way history was taught and how that teaching felt in relation to your whiteness?
I think we need to
That's
short.
8 questions.
Yeah, that's actually.
Well, meaning
Just choose what you like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
respond. So yeah, choose.
rather than going
Yeah,
I think we
around
should
the
talk
table.
about the education experience.
Yeah.
We do need to.
That's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Matthew. We can address
I
what you
mean,
like.
there are, Matthew give me, there is a white Virgin Islands culture, and especially as times move towards modernization and with American gentrification happening on St. John, specifically St. John, that's where my experience is. There is now a white American transplanted culture that has not assimilated and is carving out a space and businesses, and it's basically replacing what is here with stateside everything. To be white in my local context basically meant I went to private school. My family has some sort of money, land, something like that. For me, me and David are kind of what's the word? Anomaly, whiteness on St. John right now, because most white people on St. John are continental. They are not identifying with, and if they do, it's just because they decided that they like to be cool with people. So they're not really from the Virgin Islands. They're just friendly and decided to assimilate a little more than others. Yes, I would say that the Virgin Islands operates as a racially ordered society. We are integrated socially. There is more acceptance between color lines and color barriers, but I think the white supremacy still is the order of the day, and we are.
I'm
Sure.
sorry to interrupt. I just asked this question because I get that level of disdain for the white continentals, but what about the black people that come in? And to me, stateside black people are more white than I am.
Oh yeah.
You know, so
yeah.
I mean, I'm just curious how that plays into it.
Black Americans don't go to St. John.
They do, and I used to have a hard time. I wouldn't be able
They're not
to
allowed.
I wouldn't be able to tell a black tourist from a black local when I was young, but as I got older, it became more easier. And I have, through my experience, basically, white. When I say white and when I say black, I'm talking more about a person's mindset rather than the color of their skin. I think of myself as a black person, even though I am racially white. And it's hard for people to understand that, but like you say, you have continental black people who come down from the States who are capitalistic in every sense of the word. They don't have any idea of what their culture is. To me, black people are indigenous to the land here. There's a folk tradition that comes along with it in a way that continental United States don't have. I just see globalization. The United States represents like globalization in a larger spectrum for me. And when I see people who don't have that, like you say, black people who are totally continental in their mindset, they're white people. They're a white person to me. Their skin is black and they don't have the privilege of being white, but they are buying into the system that oppresses them. So it's like you're the house slave in a sense. It's like you're pushing for the slave master because he feeds you and makes you puts good clothes on your back.
I think our society kind of filters that out sort of naturally in a way. I've noticed that anyone here will have probably more acceptance within most black communities in the Virgin Islands than a person who appears to be black coming from the States. I think our people can. I guess that's part of what Creole means too. I think there's no. I mean, we can identify. To me, when a black American is an American, right? I don't share Matthew's opinion that they would be considered white, and so they probably wouldn't want to identify themselves that way themselves, but, you know.
I mean, sure, they definitely wouldn't, and especially their experience that they've experienced definitely is not, they don't have a white experience, so sure, but their thought process, their mindset, and the way they operate, they are invested in whiteness.
They don't have a Creole experience.
They don't have a Creole experience, they have a white experience, they have an American experience, which.
But that's not a birthright. I mean, look at your brother, right? You're talking about a difference in, you know, there's an isolation that can happen here, there's a denial that can happen here. You know,
Yeah, I mean, like.
towards those same things that you guys were domesticated in the same way.
Yeah, I went to private school from kindergarten, and so private school up until about 9th grade was I was maybe 1 or 2 black people in the class. I was in this isolated white community, and it disgusted me. By the time I came up and I had an idea, my ego came out and was like, I am Matthew, give me, I am who I am, let me start figuring out what I like. And it's just like looking at this preferential treatment that they were giving me because I was a white male, and I was like, you guys can go blow it out your ass. It disgusted me and made me angry to the point where I wanted to fight against it, and I sabotaged quite a few school projects and academic things because it was representative of the global society and global community coming and trying to lay it's like they're making everything the same. They're homogenizing everything, and it's not my experience.
It's interesting to hear that from a younger person because, you know, the older people sitting around this table definitely were in that stitch. You know, right when it was ground zero, going down, you know, and pretty interesting in terms of. I was hoping that we'd actually have an older person, you know, even here that you know, because before the pre-stitch almost, you know. So sorry to.
Going on to the next, Virgin Islands is, it's racially ordered. What binds us together as a society? Money, right now. That's what I would say. I mean, when you go to local people, I would say our culture, our history, and our experiences, fishing, farming, planting, dealing with the weather, hurricanes, those kind of. I think Mother Nature binds us together because it's a very special place here, but nowadays people are disconnected, and so it's all about money and business and yada 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 yada. National
Experience
identity.
is the big one that binds us.
Experience,
Yeah.
and our geological placement is a direct, nature versus nurture. It's, we can't look at it as a binary thing. It's one and the same. They're two operate on each other and affect each other. National identity that supersedes racial identity. For the most part, I would think that Virgin Islanders consider themselves American for the large context of people. I would think a lot of people, we here are in a privileged position. Our mindsets of what we're thinking about race come from the privilege of having the ability to even question this thing. Lots of people out here are so caught in the day-to-day survival that they can't question these kind of questions, and they know themselves to be American. And that's it. That's how they. Some people think of themselves as Virgin Islanders, but then you think a lot of Virgin Islanders don't think we have the power to be economically stable by ourselves, and therefore we're American. We have to rely on the metropole for our survival, which is bull, but hey. My primary school experience was private, white, and elitist. Secondary or tertiary level, I'm not sure. I guess that's British. Primary and secondary school is British systems. But my high school, as I graduated my elementary school, I went into the next private high school on the island, and then the two of them joined within the next 2 years. So I never left the same. I went to the same school from kindergarten to 12th grade. Do I remember thinking about history? Yeah, history was taught from an American point of view because Caribbean history didn't exist. In 11th grade, I finally demanded from school that they give us a Virgin Islands Caribbean history class. There was no curriculum. We basically made it up ourselves as we went along. It was disgusting. So, that's where the white people are being taught at St. John.
Thank you, Matthew.
I would say no. There is no white Creole identity here. I think there's a metamorphosis of white and black identities.
Who are
And-
you, by the way?
John.
How old are you?
Sorry. Well, I think that you'll see that, particularly in my timeline of education, that it is time specific in terms of, the experience, right? So I would say no, there is no Creole identity here. I think there's a metamorphosis of white and black identities along a class stratification. I think, for an example, the keeper that I see now, the keeper of traditional cultures in the Virgin Islands are the Frenchies. They're still living in culture even more so than the black families here that predate them, but segregated though also by their own intentions, which is kind of interesting, and subsequently interbred by their own intentions. Yet the American polarized around them as white people. They live next to them. It's interesting that our suburbia is north side, and it was predominantly a French enclave, or one of the French enclaves. Yet in their evolution as Virgin Islanders, they're now viewed as black in an inclusionary sense. So in a way, we have defined our own stratifications along racial identities. White, white family. I don't ask my, I don't know, I would say ask my mom, who is in denial of her mixing, and through an inclusion of a post-colonial social elitism that she enjoyed, in the islands. And most mixed race people did, of that generation. And they could be considered white, not only by the American continentals, but segmented perhaps, there's 25 different Virgin Islands isolated in cliques or even as elitisms. So there's a natural identity crisis compounded by transmigration, exclusion, and corrupted by Americanisms. Education, time related, I think is very important. I was born in 1960 weird. Had an elementary experience in the 60s and 70s that was parochial. It was pretty mixed, but subjected to discriminations, more from default than by desire, and then compounded by the parochial aspects of different religions and their own prejudices. So I was viewed as white or black as deemed fit by the viewer, more so than myself. By the middle school experience, which was the 70s and 80s, I noticed more of a divide and more of a shift of being perceived as white, which was a little confounding for me, because I always viewed my inner self, as more of a black Virgin Islander, if such, although my family, being black Virgin Islanders, had a lot of denials. So by the high school experience in the 80s, it really was confusing my my psyche, but by then I had developed the ability to play in both pastures, and then that confused the viewer, and I think that's really when I started enjoying confusing people. I really found some humor in it. I really found a little bit of a resistance in it. And then by college, which was an experience that exported out of here, although I went to the university there for a little bit, I was perceived as white, but always felt out of place. My first collegiate experience was in the Midwest, playing tennis and having that whole ego, competitive collegiate experience. And I ended up hanging out with black fraternity people, but I never joined, which was interesting. And so getting to the history experience of what I learned in school, I would say all the history I learned in school up until maybe the collegiate level, or maybe even through the collegiate level, because I've continued to educate myself to the history and to my history and to the history of this place. I would say all the history that I learned in school was whiteness. And through my own fruition that I started to discover the real story, and still am to this day. That's it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
History.
that's it, yeah.
Good, thanks, Yulima.
Okay, well,
Who are you first?
I'm Monica Marine, and I don't know, I think, just to kind of speak for St. Croix, I think it's interesting just to note that a lot of the colonial families have become mixed now. So a lot of those, I mean, I guess that there's maybe like some that have retained their Danish identity, but for the most part, a lot of those initial families are now mixed. And I think that, you know, it's interesting to really consider that it's not so much of really race, but really more class that really define people's identity, I think, in that generation. And we've kind of adopted this American notion of, you know, apartheid and,
Black, white.
you know, the one-drop rule, so then immediately you're black, but really, I think at least I think for the Virgin Islands, I don't think for that generation people really are defined, they don't define their identity by that. So, yeah, so I think in terms of my experience, I went to private school, Antilles, as a young kid, and then Country Day. I would say my experience at Antilles was a lot more white, but I would say that once I went to St. Croix, it was a lot more, the private school experience there was more mixed. So my graduating class in '98, 60%, I would say, you know, a mixture of Puerto Rican, mixed kids, either their parents were from America and they were mixed race, or just mixed from the Caribbean, or black Caribbean, Crucian. And then the rest, I would say maybe like 30% were white, your Hess kids and that.
And was that a private school or
Yeah, it's a
parochial
private
school?
private school.
It's a private
Yeah.
school.
There aren't a whole lot of parochial schools.
Is
There's
it
only a
only
few,
one,
like,
right?
well, there's St. Joseph. It's not quite like how it is in St.
Country Day is
Thomas.
still that way because I remember playing sports for them, and I was always like, there was white kids, but you could see that they weren't white. They were like, you know, they were pool white.
Well, no, and I think that I really love that you said what you said, because I think that we need to consider like how we're defining ourselves and still using the slave master's terms and the colonizer's language, and I think that we need to come up with our own language and our own identity, and I like that you're, you know, doing that, and you're
Continental.
Yeah.
That's why I love Rastafari.
We get it.
and that's kind of, I guess, Keanu, to give Keanu his credit where credit's due, like the coloniality of power, and his whole breakdown of race, I think, is the most brilliant.
Coloniality.
The Peruvian cultural critic, I think, in terms of, you know, defining race, he defines really how it was basically to subjugate. So the colonizer, it was a superior inferiority. So immediately, as soon as the Americas are being colonized 200 years ago, the first definition is the native, and then it was the black person, and it was because those were the people that were, you know, they were tilling the land, and they were the ones that were your wage workers, or not wage workers. So then they became, you know, the distinctions of race are defined then. So I think now we need to kind of move beyond that and come up with our own, you know, I guess, identity. And what else? So I think that's about where I'll leave off.
All right, Miles, I think that Johnny Wema summed it up the best as far as my attitude towards it. Is there such a thing as white Creole? Virgin Islands, I think it would be probably best exemplified by the French continuation of the culture. Personally, I think also, it's been touched on here, that class, I think, certainly in my youth determined the level of immersion in culture that you had here. My mother's era, say, they were poverty level. She lived in a housing on the airport, right next to the airport. They had a dirt floor. After that, they lived in Garden Street communally with everybody everybody in that area was fairly poor, and they all lived together as a community. And you know, when I was a kid, it was definitely, you know, I'd neglected to say it before, but I guess lower middle class was my family, and then I personally have just recently, or it's still in the throes of climbing out of poverty level. We've always had land here, but no money. So
There's a burden with having land here. For
yeah,
sure.
because
It takes your money.
you have to keep paying for it,
Right.
unless you
Unless you're
level
able
it,
to keep
it's
it agricultural, like a
agricultural.
couple families.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you learn to work some angles there. At school, I went to initially a Montessori school in my earliest years here. It was a pretty good equal mixture, and then to Antilles school for like lower school. Again, at that time, Antilles was fairly well, reasonably equally mixed. Mostly local kids. There was the odd statesider that would come through, and I was in the class with your brother, Jeff Uema.
Until we got kicked out.
Right, which happens. But I saw the transition happen there, and that was my early experience of, you know, the predominantly American or stateside white kid coming in, and then they felt put upon, I suppose, or threatened by the fact that, you know, the local kids were in there, and then if you're local white, even more of a threat because you weren't falling into their neat little categorization of where you should fall into things. And so, and at that time, I guess the school became more and more affluent, and more white stateside kids would come in, and it got to be kind of
What it is today.
exactly. And so I dropped out of school many times. Eventually went back to school at St. Peter and Paul, and I went to school with at least 4 of you guys around the table, and it was majority black. But I was extremely happy there. I felt very comfortable. And then University of Virgin Islands, of course, majority black. So I guess I feel strongly that when people come in, especially on a professional level, you know, you're dealing with, you know, continentals or statesiders. And they're cool with you until they find out that you're not, or they think they've accepted you as being like them. And then at some point they find out you're not. And then they're actually sort of angry because, oh my God, you've betrayed their confidence because you infiltrated their
Whiteness.
world as an imposter. So there's that. So I guess that would wrap it up. I do find that I've done a lot of work. Virgin Islands history, very strong in St. Peter and Paul. But they did an adequate job, I think. The other schools right now are doing, Antilles, for example, is doing a pretty good job at trying to teach a fair representation of Virgin Islands history and culture. They work with me at the St. Thomas Historical Trust. I'm preparing, transfer day perspectives and everything for them for this year coming up. But what I did find interesting was last year my daughter was in 3rd grade, and they covered Columbus, and Columbus being part of our history. But now he's kind of been recast as a villain, and like just a total ultra bad guy, which I think is kind of interesting, because he was always portrayed from my childhood, and he was my hero.
He's a hero, right?
So and there's a Spaniard in her class, and her parents came in, they were irate and just berated the teacher.
He's talented.
But see, different time-space continuum, because there was no, just in your little dichotomy, but then you go back to David's, education here, or generation education here, and it was just non-existent. You know, just non-existent.
David
And-
Senior.
Yeah, David Senior. And I was in that same kind of stitch of, you know, I had to learn those things on my own. Even in the black family of educators and historians, there was a denial and not a transfer of that knowledge. That had to go back and, of course, bust them, call them out on some stuff, you know. And they were like, oh, well, yes, you know, yes, you're right. You know, but.
Well, we
you
write
know.
it this way because we can't scare the little children.
Right. Or if we want the little children to come out the way that we want them to come out, you know.
Exactly.
And,
We're going back to what John had said earlier. The older generations, and I've done a lot of documentary work, filming people like Blanche Sasso and Ursula Krieger. And if they were any bit of an upper crust, sort of economically, they were certainly elitist. They just wouldn't talk about certain things. If you'd ask them something like, okay, well, a typical day, how did you do your laundry? Oh, we don't know. The maids did that. But, you know, she was with the maid every day that she did the laundry, but they just won't talk about it. And my grandmother fell into that category as well, and that, you know, things they just didn't. If it was in any way denigrated them as they felt, they just wouldn't address it. For example, my mother's father never said a word about him. We don't know anything about him other than he was most likely American Indian, because when she went to the States, they lived on an Indian reservation and she had children that were born on the Indian reservation. So, and then she came back here and had nothing more to do with him after that. And never a word, not a word about it. So, I mean, and I think that's, you know, very telling, because there's a certain inability to get information out of people from our history, depending on what they deemed as something that you could socially discuss. And St. Thomas historically has been paired not really along racial lines, but as socioeconomic levels. And also I also think that as part of the Creole or West Indian experience, it is time sensitive. When I grew up, you couldn't get milk. There was no fresh meat. It was very limited what you could get that would be as far as perishable goods coming in. If we wanted meat, we had to go across the road to the Hartmans. Right here, this garage on the side of the road was a butcher shop. The bottom of the hill here was Bootsman's Bakery, a Dutch bakery. So it was smaller communities, and you knew everyone. Now it's a much different scene. We've got Walgreens, we've got Kmart. So as far as, I don't know, it's very hard. I think it's becoming increasingly more difficult to have any more sort of a sense of an identity with Creoleness, or because of globalization and corporatization, things going out the window.
Well, perhaps if we did, we might have stopped some of those big box things coming in, right? Because we would have had but that, that underlying Americanism is just
Catches you.
really amazing, and polarized the whole Caribbean. The whole transmigration through this little thing, it just polarized the whole Caribbean American dollar.
It is a neo-colonial experience.
Neo-colonial
And
is a good
we
word.
just, until people recognize it for what it is and come to terms with it, we are just in an ongoing colonial loop, repeating history. And the colonial powers come in and they exploit, and they try to diminish the local culture so that their culture becomes dominant.
So
That's what's going on.
this is a problem that's current all over the world. It happened in Hawaii, where the Hawaiians were pushed off their land by the Japanese and other cultures. And it happens, and it's funny enough, because when I was in the Cook Islands, it's not happening there because they cannot sell their land. They can lease it, but they can't sell it. So it can't be bought.
There's a law.
Yeah, they go back to the old Maori traditional chief laws, and you cannot sell your property.
Are they a U.S. protectorate, or are they, what is their
New Zealand.
national, they're New Zealand?
New Zealand. But what has happened throughout the world is that, in islands specifically, is that islanders do not evolve economically, and that's a problem, because everybody from the Russians to Europeans to Americans, they want someplace warm, and they want the beach, and they want the palm trees, and they want their duckies. And they will come to your island, and if they have the money, they're going to buy it.
The whole
And
thing.
they will push you aside, and they don't care about, it's just the way things work. And the only way you can change that is to help, first of all, make people aware of it. And second, as islanders, we need to evolve economically. If you don't, you're doomed. You see what's going on with St. John. You know, St. John used to be a small type community, and now we got Peter Bay, and it's just gonna...
Sarah Noosa and Grand Bay and...
Right, and that's just the way things have worked in history. And the only way you can fix that problem is to educate and to educate the locals so that they're successful and that they can actually afford to pay for their land tax and to keep their land and not lose their culture in the process. When I travel abroad, when you tell someone that you're from the Caribbean or from the Virgin Islands, that has a lot of value. There's not a lot of us. There's a lot of Americans, there's a lot of Europeans.
And they all think it's
Russians.
wonderful.
They
Oh,
think-
isn't that wonderful?
Right, so they think so there's
Honeymoon
value.
paradise.
And they always say, but you're white.
There's
Yeah.
value.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
value.
I had trouble convincing people.
Most people when I travel and I say I'm from the Virgin, they have no idea what the hell that is. And then you have to
Maybe Puerto Rico,
Maybe-
next to Puerto Rico?
no, Puerto Rico they don't know, Jamaica they know.
Yep.
And then that starts a conversation, and then they actually go to their iPhone and they'll pull up a map. They should show me on the phone where you're at. So, but we need to evolve economically. If we don't, we're all doomed. End of story, we're gonna be bought out. Might not be now, it'll be, 20, 30 years, and because everybody wants the beach, the warm spots, especially during winter time.
I
have to step
need
away
to say
from
something here, because, let's face it, the French community, what we would consider the French St. Bart's Frenchy community here.
True French.
Yeah. This isn't, I use the term, you might resent it, don't resent it, but it's like a tribe,
Right.
okay? It is a distinct, recognizable culture. And the people who are part of that culture, the Creoles, know who they are and have a strong sense of identity, okay? And it's interesting that they have been able to retain that sense and identity since, a lot of that, the roots of that group, a lot of them go back to St. Kitts and the earliest indentured servants and so on that were brought up to the colonies, and a lot of people of French heritage here can trace their heritage all the way back to the very beginning of settlement within the Caribbean.
Those smaller French islands too, in terms of, I think divestment, colonial divestment has a lot to do with that strength of identity.
I think we have to take that example and ask ourselves, how is it that this community was able to retain its unique sense of identity and culture over such a long period of time? And when you talk about that it's important to take control of our own economy as islanders and so on, that doesn't always mean mimicking the American or world global economy as far as what a successful economy is.
Needs.
It's clear that, the French Creole community or tribe within the Caribbean survived through long periods of extreme hardship in places like La Saline in St. Bart's, arid desert, salt and crusted places,
I believe they
where
survived
virtually
by being
nothing
closed communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were in control of their own economy.
And that's the thing, is that they had the ability to be in control of it because of their proximity to whiteness. They were allowed to, they had the, at a certain point, they had to, even in the beginning, when slavery started, Irish people weren't white, Jewish people weren't white, French people weren't white. These people weren't white. English, British people were white. Everybody else was some other type of ethnicity. And then as slavery continued, white people had to expand and take in these other ethnic groups of white people. And now all these people become white. And a French person who has a Frenchie who has the identity that they are a Creole, and now you're giving them white privilege, they're not going to go and assimilate to being white. We are who we are, and you can't tell us who we are. A black person could try and say that. It won't necessarily survive as much because you're going to have everybody coming and pointing the hammer down on them. What are you trying to stand up for? You have no right to stand up. You are a slave.
French St. Bart's managed to keep its French identity through over 100 years of colonialism by Sweden.
Right.
You know?
Okay, let's stop.
And let me tell you what happened in St. Bart's, just so you guys know.
Hold on a minute, just because we want to make sure that everybody gets their own
Absolutely.
perspective. This is great that we kind of interject a little bit, but going back and forth. But are you feeling that you have covered the questions before we move on?
My last point would be that I believe that the Economic Development Council and their policy is what has led it jump. If you, as Alan was saying, is inevitable end, but I think that the EDC has certainly, in the past 10 to 15 years, just sped up the process of disenfranchising and alienating.
That's our whole economic policy in the Virgin Islands.
Yeah.
Because it's set at a federal level. What people forget is we are colony. And
Exactly.
we are not making our own decisions. Our decisions are being made out of the Department of Interior. You know?
If we made decisions, good decisions, we'd be taking
And
their money.
we're allowed to give input. Oh, they're great at giving symposiums and seminars and let us all talk our talk, but it only gets into the process if you agree with the process.
Well, or become the process, because that EDC program that you talk about was the IDC program, and it was architected by a black Virgin Islander for both the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. But he had become an American at that point. He wasn't standing up like Rothschild Francis, for instance, right? He just became American, got in that American construct and said, hey, this would be a great program for America. Check this out. I'm American, maybe through a desire of, being a young economist and wanting to move ahead in the career scape of America, right? So it's very interesting because that was, Amadeo Francis, black Virgin Island Puerto Rican on top of it. And that was a lateral thing to have a vision for both of his homelands, so to speak, right? And it's interesting how the Americanism, really polarized our thought. And if you look at probably our best days, and maybe in a certain extent, the best days for St. Bart's and Anguilla in terms of identity and keeping that identity was in the divestment when we were forgotten. And in our case, post-emancipation, pre-Navy.
Exactly.
We were left to rot. Everybody got together. Maybe there was a true Creole community at that point. You talk about the things that, butchers, and we were exporting meat to Puerto Rico in 1939. Now we don't, they're closing down abattoirs, So it's an interesting time, and, when you're getting into the polarized things like, St. Bart's, Anguilla is another interesting place where they don't have an identity crisis. But both of those guys suck salt, literally.
And St. John didn't in that post-transfer period. They developed a distinct Creole society, St. Johnians, who are a distinct Creole group.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
That do not, as far as I'm concerned, basically don't exist anymore. The ones that
No, it's
that
not.
retain it.
So let's keep the flow.
I'll just wrap
But
up
we
my
have to
thing.
touch,
Yeah,
we have to
let's-
touch on that
One point.
economy question again.
We will definitely, and we'll have some time to kind of free. Okay.
After we go around, don't.
Okay.
But I think we have to face the facts. There are, when you look around here, there are very few historically St. Thomian families and the same thing's happening in St. John now, but there are very few left here. They've
Yeah.
sold out, they've either been forced to, or
There's very
I mean,
few
now I'm
movers.
considered, now I'm
Well,
considered local St. John,
that's-
and I'm 2 generations in. My grandparents came here in the 40s, and people look at me like, you use us, you know, you're part of, you're a St. Johnian, and I'm just like, well, yeah, I know I am, but when I look at myself, I'm a transplant. I'm a white person from the continental United States. It's just I happen to assimilate.
Well, you know, what I'm hearing from you, and I don't know if we overlooked this, I kind of got, is number 4, you know, have you experienced internal conflicts?
Yep.
And I didn't
Yeah.
talk about that, and I'm seeing a lot of internal
Oh, yeah.
conflicts in
Oh,
this
yeah.
young Virgin Islander, right?
Oh, yeah.
And with me, you know, maybe coming from the elite black background, I didn't have as many internal contacts. I grew up in Garden Street in this little community village type thing until I really got on the street, you know. And I just want to interject something because you really see
When you
it.
get
I
on
think
the
there's a
street, it
different,
changes you.
different generational thing, but very similar, you know. So, you know, answering to have you experienced internal conflicts about your identity and can contradictory feelings of both belonging and non-belonging be experienced at different times, I would say, you know, other than being called honky, white cheese, white nigger, which is my term, and then he black, he alright, I would say no, you know, and no to the integration as well, you know, would not say that I've had jungle fever, but I've had jungle sweats now and then, but I think that other people have feelings caused by that lateral movement, you know, they have feelings where if you really can do this lateral thing between white and black, you know, it gets very confounding to the individual as well, you know, to the individual as well.
Yeah.
And belonging, to me, belonging is kind of getting to what Alan's saying, you know, about being an islander. To me, belonging here or being part of this group is really the island knowledge. The bits of real history that I've been able to acquire on my own a lot of times, or through family somewhat, and then really through my real connection as being an islander or Virgin Islander, maybe even an islander, which is a great distinction, is my communion with nature. You know, I think that is really in our face here, and that's what we should kind of be, and then non-belonging.
And that's being lost too.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I think for purposes,
Well,
Can
you
I
guys,
just say
only
something?
because
Can I just say something
yeah,
about non-belonging?
the
Because
problem is that we have to be mindful that Annalee isn't familiar with what we are. I think if we could do a little synopsis, I think right now what I'm hearing is all of our experiences are being influenced by a generational time frame as well as a class and social time frame, and you know, we all have had different experiences that have molded who we are, and now we're confronted with a Virgin Islands that has changed dramatically
Due to American occupation.
due to American occupation due to our colonial state of mind.
Which I see as one and the same, it's just the American occupation of the world.
Yeah. So, but we want to give everybody, and I don't know, David, if you said you had a suggestion. I mean, I think that a lot of the things that are coming up are really valid and interesting, and we
Yeah.
may want to segue away from these questions and just
Right,
go
and we're
for
answering some of them. Some of
We're
the
already
other ones
answering. But
already.
what's important right now, as far as for purposes of documentation, is that anytime you speak, please give your name, and maybe just finish up this set of questions, and then I don't know, what was your suggestion, David?
Well, there's a couple here that we haven't touched on that I think we do need to talk about, and that would be, I think number 7 is important. Do you experience privilege because of your whiteness or perceived whiteness? How so? Can you speak about the relationship between whiteness and economic, professional, or social privilege? Or can you speak about having been rejected, denied opportunity, or ostracized because of your whiteness or perceived whiteness? That's on a lived reality.
And I think when we go around the
That's-
table, maybe we should reverse directions once in a
That's
while.
what you
Okay.
just said.
Okay.
You know, sure.
So maybe we could start with Alyssa, maybe, and go back to question 2 and 3, and maybe even 7.
Okay, it's Elisa.
Elisa, sorry.
Thank you. As far as being privileged because being white, I think maybe it's just, I don't know if it's just me, but I think the other Catholic school kids here would say that white, black, it was never a defining thing for me. We just were. You know, it wasn't until I was in college that I was like, wow, my grandfather's a black man. Like that, I didn't look at him and think that. I didn't look at my grandmother and think she's white. They were just the people that they are. They are my grandparents that, you know, raised us and cared for us as much as my parents did. So to identify as being white or black, that's something that happened once I got to the States and once I got to school, and I was forced to identify. And like a number of you have said, once we got to college, the two questions I got were, wow, you're not black, a statement, and the second one was, oh, so you must have grown up sailing at the yacht club, which was not my experience at all. I doubt that it was for anybody else here at this table. I did not spend. We worked the earth and we ate what we grew and.
Don't really get to St. Bart's.
What?
He said me, but I used it to get to like Antigua and St. Bart's. I would get on the boats to go.
Well, you didn't grow up sailing so that you can compete in races with the yacht club.
We didn't have that. We didn't even have that.
When we were growing up.
Yeah,
The
we
yacht
didn't have
club?
that. Not in my generation.
No, I mean, so my experience was living according to nature and with the rhythms and what was in, like the seasons were mangoes and avocados at this time, soursop, and this is when this is in season, and then you eat as much of it as you can because it'll be out of season and you won't get it again for the rest of the year. And there's a real beauty that comes with that. And so that and like.
But excuse me, there's no seasons in the Virgin Islands.
So for me, like social privilege didn't come from being white or black. Social privilege came from being a continental or not. And we were not privileged. We literally were living hand to mouth and doing the best we can and relying on each other for survival. You know, one day my dad caught more fish than his brother did, so we would share it, or they would all go and kill the goat and have that. And that's my experience. And interestingly, it's turned around in a lot of ways, and there are times when being Creole, you know, as a label, it's yet another label, so I don't really like using that word, but so now we're seen as privileged because we have land and we have a history and experience that other people envy, but they don't see the suffering and the pain and the labor that went into that. And you know, I went to public school with all the other Frenchies, like it seemed like all the Frenchies went to the same public school. And there were black kids there too, but that distinction was never made other than like these are the Frenchy kids and these are the local kids. And the same in high school. All the Frenchies went to Catholic school, and then there were the local kids. So that's the distinction, I guess, more than whiteness or blackness or social privilege.
Can you talk about that word local and how was that used in your upbringing?
Well,
You just were.
you just.
You just were.
Well, no,
Well, there were the
she made a
Frenchies.
distinction between
Local
French
black
kids
people.
and local people. So local was
Well, I can't say local black people because there were local people of every race. There were Trinidadians. There were, you know.
So why was the distinction made between French and local?
Maybe
It's
you
mostly
would
the
agree or
call
disagree
family
with me,
names.
Alan, but it was the Frenchies and everybody else. And why was that? I guess it goes back to what you were saying, but
I think
we have a very
yeah.
distinct experience.
Yeah, I think for me there was the Frenchy community. There was also during the time that I was growing up, there were more Puerto Ricanos maybe than people from the Dominican Republic. So you had the Latino communities, and then you know you had the Virgin Islanders, and then the West Indians or Down Islanders, the Eastern Caribbean people. at one time, the terminology being Garrett, which now is an ugly word. And so,
Which was
yeah, and I think
Hilo,
Ga-
and then
Yeah,
Garrett
Gaso's
is
like more of
Canoe.
like a Santo, like
Yeah, you got
very
some.
derogatory.
Yeah,
It's
Santo,
like
well,
Garrett.
like
Garrett is Down
Dominican-
Islander,
people
Gaso is
from
Dominican.
Oh, Garrett
Yeah.
is mostly
Yeah.
Antiguan.
So-
Hilo is
Garçon means son in patois.
Yeah,
Garçon.
garçon. It's
So,
it's
but
boy or
it's-
son or
it's
it's just
like-
like the man.
Boy.
yeah,
It's like starting a conversation by calling someone boy and they're a full grown man.
Which
It's
is
already
derogatory.
right.
yeah.
So-
Well, there,
It's-
I mean,
it's a term they
the
use
term
for women,
cha-cha
right?
was very derogatory
Cha-cha,
at one
yeah.
time, and that word has evolved a
Well, you
little
know,
bit.
you got called white boy here.
But-
You never
so-
got called white man.
So-
Never got called
basically-
white.
He's
You
a
never
white
got
boy.
called. You're
That's not
60
white
years
boy.
old. You're a white boy.
We,
What
to go back to your question, there were a lot of Spanish speakers and Puerto Ricans in high school, and they weren't local, they were Puerto Ricans, right?
Well, unless you're talking about my cousins, Troy and London and them and
Yeah.
We had
They
a lot-
all- I
we had a
think-
lot of Americans
yeah.
as well.
Because-
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I think they've evolved too. I mean, I think Crucians have a strong Puerto Rican history and influence, and they consider themselves Cruiserican.
But I think for me, it's most important to note that these distinctions were not in any way negative or exclusatory. It just was identifying rather
Mhm.
than
Rather than
separating.
connotation.
I mean, it's separated, but not.
Not in a sense where it was like that's
We're
a
better
white
than
boy.
you are.
We don't
Yeah.
fit a
We're
white
all
boy.
part of the struggle, which was a struggle. You know, I use loosely. It's just the experience of growing up in an island that was
Rough.
more isolated than it is now, but certainly less isolated than it was previously.
Yeah, and I think the class structure makes a big difference. I mean, I had a brief experience in Montessori and Antilles as a young child. Both my parents worked. They were working class, so you know, I'd have people taking care of me who were of West Indian descent. So, but I think through fifth grade. Fifth grade is when I started Catholic school through junior high. I experienced a very interesting dynamic. Lots of Frenchies at Catholic school, lots of West Indians in Catholic school, some Latinos as well. I was always, at first, we all want to know who you are, where you're from initially. And so I was always, you must be Frenchy, No, I'm not Frenchy, but my mother's Puerto Riqueña. So automatically I got accepted and categorized as
Caribbean,
Puerto Riqueña. So that was an interesting dynamic. And throughout my experience going to school, I went to the States, and that was a whole different dynamic. And even having done high school in Puerto Rico was a different dynamic, because even there I was considered la nena blanca, tú sabes. But then when I went to UVI, I was the token white girl in my class, because UVI was predominantly West Indian.
Would everyone here agree
Yeah.
that identity, in your lifetime experience, I was going to say, it sounds like everybody's saying is, your identity is challenged the most by white stateside Americans.
Yes.
Those are the people who
Yeah.
challenge you the most.
But it comes from a place
Up
of
until
class, I
recently,
think.
right?
Up until I just wrote that
Up until
down.
really
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah, and what's missing in this group, like I said, the older person, I think the really young person, because you'd be getting a totally different perspective of that. And it's interesting that you fall in that category where you didn't feel it. But I grew up in town and I felt it. And you have to look at where, well, I'll talk about that, but where racism came. Racism's kind of historically been like an excuse in islands, and now it's becoming a real thing, but along different means, different passages. So, I'm sorry.
But I think we are a little more, in my experience, as you've mentioned, we were a little more integrated, at least the Catholic school experience, we were more integrated. And to see right now the racial issues happening in the continental United States, for example, and even within our community here now, I'm like blown away, because I don't understand how there could be that strong animosity. And even the descriptions from David Jr. and Matthew about their experiences on St. John are pretty, I'm like, whoa, really?
Well, they were in a transition. You know, you got to understand where these guys
We're
are
on the
coming
ass
from.
end of America, taking everything
Yeah.
over.
But listen, St. John stayed so isolated for so
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
And it had a distinct Creole society.
Right.
Okay? Now, when I was growing up, we may not have used the word Creole, but the word that we haven't really spoken here that was used was native.
Native, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people referred to themselves as natives.
Or local,
You know?
or locally.
Let's give it
Yeah,
back
but
to,
here, St. John, but
Yeah.
see, St. John didn't hit that brick wall until of like colonial occupation until really recently. It started with the park, okay?
Yeah, the park
But
started
there was
You-
a slow assimilation,
But-
and it's recent. I mean,
The
it's
murders
these
of
guys'
David
generation.
Geiger
Oh,
and
We're the
incredible
Jamie
parabolic
hyper
shift.
change, yeah,
Yeah.
parabolic.
let's give it back
So,
here. I just felt that we relate a lot more too, so that's why I interjected a little bit more than other people's experiences.
I just wanted to say that in relation to a lot of the racial conversations that are going on in America right now, part of this Creole experience is to me, a certain degree of racial blindness. And because I certainly was blind to race, and there's one distinct time when I was in college, and I went to college in Atlanta, which is a very black area, and you know, my instinct is to say colored, which I was told by an American person that that's derogatory, but is it? Do you guys find that to be?
I find that colored is a little outdated.
You can say people, like, how they use the term now is people of color, that's what they say.
I mean,
No, but I'm just saying,
It's
that's
just so much political
That's-
correctness.
Yeah, no, that's people of
it's
color.
not-
that's what the
POC.
word that they use, just like
I mean,
they-
you say it's just
Hispanics don't refer themselves as Hispanics, they say Latino.
So,
That's
but,
the irony
but
of
it wasn't
America.
until I got
As
to
long as you-
college, and I was going to college in Atlanta, which is a traditionally black area, and I was talking to this black guy, and I walked away, and another person in my class was like, "Why are you talking to that black guy?" And
He's my dealer.
I just didn't understand what was happening at that moment. And it took a while for me to process that moment in time. But I am grateful for all those years of being blind to race. And I feel pretty strongly that my son, too, is growing up blind to race. You know, my grandmother passed away a couple weeks ago, and at church, looking around, there were people of every shade of color, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I love that, and I love that, you know, my next personal generation will have that blindness as well.
Or do you think
I
it's
hope
just
not.
an acknowledging that everyone's, you know, even in their different skin or whatever, looking differently, they're still not judging them?
You
Because
take
there's a
people for
difference-
who they are,
Yeah.
and their values,
Okay.
and not, you know, because you're one shade, you know, high, what is it?
Well, see,
high
I grew
color.
up in a different reality because the French community, especially now, is viewed as black. You know, it's really interesting because I grew up seemingly white in Charlotte-Amalie, you know, and I got out on the streets at a very young age, and I was subjected to a lot more racism. I saw a lot more, but it was a default for us. It wasn't there really when you really found a common ground and a commonality, but it was there learned from America.
But what I think is
Exactly.
also interesting is that I look a lot like my grandmother, and she's as white bread, and my grandfather was a short black man, and so there's a photo of them, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, my God, that was, you know, all these decades ago, and I wonder what that experience was like for her, because it was never discussed ever. It was never a thing. It was never an issue for us. But what was that like for her marrying a black man?
Right.
And I suspect that she would have had an easier time then than she would today. Like somebody
Really?
marrying a black man
I
today.
mean, I would like to say something about the color blindness too. I mean, back in the day, because the Virgin Islands wasn't black and white until America started coming
just
in and
were.
putting in. we were just where there was gradations.
Pre-civil
There was,
rights.
there was
Post-civil
mulatto,
rights.
there was middle, there was white, and the closer you got to whiteness is usually the more privilege you had. But in today's society with America and everything, color blindness is dangerous because you have neoliberal people who out here
Yeah.
spouting this
You
colorblind
don't say
rhetoric
that.
who don't
Oh, you don't
understand
even say
that black people
post-racial.
are still oppressed on the same bases that they've been oppressed on for the last
Exactly.
500 years. And granted, down here, we don't feel it as strongly, but I mean, you still, the term welfare queen is alive and well in America. You know, black and white is alive and well. It hasn't gone anywhere. And to think that we could just say, oh, I'm not going to worry, you're equal to me now because there's no racism is a lie.
We need to discuss this point, I think, of what Matthew's talking about, because there's a term, I think, that, you know, in critical race theory, in the way that race is typically discussed in everything from popular culture to academia at this point in America, you know, this term white privilege, which we're discussing, which has certain tenets to it, right? And I think it's generally understood that there's material sides to that. There's a material privilege generally that comes with being white in a lot of societies. But then there's also, in certain societies like America, there's a privilege of not, it's the privilege of not knowing anything about race.
Mhm.
Like growing up, I would think of saying like, well, white is the default. If you're white, if you're a white American, for instance, white is the default. So you never.
If you're American, you're white.
You grow up in the suburbs, and that's just what it is. Everybody else has an ethnicity, but you don't. As a white person, don't.
You're not a white American. There's no such thing.
White minorities, such as in the Caribbean, or people who are identified as white, even if you wouldn't identify that way yourself, which a lot of us don't, right? But being identified that way, you do not have the privilege in the Caribbean, for instance, as a white person, to not understand race. I don't think. You know, you may, as you were saying, but I think you were saying about color blindness.
That's changed in the last 10 years, but yeah.
Is saying that, well, you know, you still judge everybody the same as a person, as a human being, and don't. It's not important in your judgments of people, but you understand the experience of, you know, of entering into a situation where you look different, or you're in experiences all the time where you can't run from the fact of your race. It's not the default. Right?
Colorblindness only works in a society that is colorblind, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That accepts, you know, those
At the
precepts.
Like what you were saying,
Well,
Yeah.
but
contextualize
But
it, which is
what I
outside
see,
of
what
the
I
Harvard
see
Math
happening
was
more and
before.
more,
Yeah.
you know, is that there isn't that acceptance, and that things are more polarized. And I think the Virgin Islands are being forced to be more polarized. And it's not just the American influence, by the way, okay? It's a lot of the people that are coming here from the rest of the Caribbean, okay? That don't have that same
sense of
of
integration. Yeah.
integration
Yeah.
of the cosmopolitanness that the Danish West Indies historically had, okay? And they have, their presence has really thrown a lot of our historiography
And their
off kilter.
economic disparity has added to that.
And then
on
there's the
top of it.
American thing. They're coming looking for the American dream.
Yeah, and they're coming to be Americans.
Yeah.
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 Well,
Let's
I
give
want-
the table to Alan now, because he's the one
I
who's
think
pointing at.
there's something that a lot of people haven't mentioned or anything, but there's color blindness in the Virgin Islands between the blacks and the Frenchies, which we would consider somewhat Creole in a sense, because the Frenchies earned it. They earned that. And they went through the hurricanes,
Yeah.
and
And
they.
they fish.
I've
they provided
actually-
food for the
I've
community.
actually been pulled over, and a taxi driver is about to yell and scream at me, and I roll down my window, and he realizes that I'm a Frenchie, and his attitude changes like that, because I went from being a white guy to all of a sudden.
Totally.
Exactly.
Oh, that's my
So
brother.
the French community has earned their stripes, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish visually, but when you do communicate with locals, they do accept you as one. But that came over, 200 years of integration and whatnot.
Of living a hard life.
Right.
Yeah.
And here's something that's very interesting,
Interesting.
and that is that in my business, as my job as the head photographer for a company, we get jobs all the time from all different types of people, mostly from the United States. and my wife is not white. She's from Trinidad and she's half Chinese. Have one or two African American employees that are actually local, but they went to school, so they sound American. And also have a local Frenchy girl that works for us. And when I do my research on our clients, I actually have to select the person for the job because the clients do the skin color and where they're from do affect how they are going to judge the person that shoots them. Especially if you're
Quality of the work.
high-end client
Send a white person.
at the Ritz-Carlton, I most likely will have to shoot it. Even though my wife can do the same exact job, she's more educated than I am. She's got a medical degree, she's a pharmacist. She'll outsmart anybody, anywhere, but the client feels safer with a white person, which to me is completely shocking and embarrassing, heartbreaking, but that's the reality. We actually have to look, she knows all the addresses in New York City, and we actually have to look at the addresses, determine what type of person this, and who can actually shoot this. And that's pretty sad.
But it's the reality of the situation of living in America.
Here's another problem too. I mean, in a way I can't blame them because we have not evolved economically. You get off of the airport, and the first thing you do, you're greeted by someone, not 100% of the time, that's maybe could be a little friendlier and is trying to stick you in a taxi, not for yourself, but with 5 other people, and you just came off a long flight. And that's their first initial experience. And so already they're like, I don't want to deal with these people. I want to deal with something I'm familiar with.
And they're viewed as local because they're black.
They're black.
Right.
And
they're
you're
all
viewed as
West Indian. Most of
non-local
them
because you're white.
Right.
And that's a precept, and it happens because, now the local person is that taxi driver that's going to yell at you, right? Or, considered local, right? So it gets this strange mix of things. And, I've had really some really amazing, having been in the States, lived in a couple places in the States, and having lived in town versus North Side, I think completely different realities. And then I have a civic kind of background in my family, an education background in family, and I could not truly, I've even tried to get involved in things civically, and you are initially blocked by being white. You're initially blocked from that. Yeah, there's a token senator, there's a token person here, but if you don't play along, you're out. And if you're really a truly, educated, worldly Virgin Islander, and you're white, or perceived as white, there's a lot of blocking there that happens, and I think it's getting more and more, like David Senior said, more and more evident, because it's happening along, and it's kind of like full circle, right, on the class elitism that we had, and now it's based on class and economic means, not class means, economic means solely, because I'll tell you one thing, a lot of rich Americans that come down here have no class at all. No class at all.
Well, the ones that come are getting more and more classless.
Right.
Well, you
We don't
have
attract the
hit
upper class.
an interesting point. What's interesting as well as what you said, that, the French community has earned their stripes. I feel a lot of the times when I go into particularly government situations, I have to kind of prove myself first.
Yeah,
and
you have to earn it now.
I'm not
You don't
just
have
a
it
gringo
by-
who just got off
Right.
the plane.
Right.
And once they understand, that
You're
I've
from
been
here.
a part of this community and I'm from here, there's a shift,
Oh,
an
big time.
attitude
Big time.
that's pretty
Big time.
dramatic.
I'll say that once they perceive you as being French, initially the respect is out of fear, I believe, because they think that the Frenchie is just going to go off and go crazy. I mean, because they come from a background of not being able to back down.
Right, and there's a reason for that, because my dad has told me stories, and he said one day when they were young, they came home and they caught this Rasta guy in their tree, picking mangoes, right? And There's several ways you can answer a question. Hey, mister, what are you doing to my tree? His answer was like, just send me here, which is an invitation to a can of ass whipping, which this guy got, and he got it really bad. My dad was like, it wasn't about the mangoes, we could care less. They were falling on the ground anyways. It was about his attitude. And at that time and era, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, everybody feared the Rothers. The Rothers feared the Frenchies because just won't tolerate it. And my dad always said it's because if you're not respected, you're gonna be treated like crap.
Yeah, you don't put your foot down, they'll walk all over you.
So, and then that's when, like, there's a mutual respect, even to this day.
That's when the dreads were making a move.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm
Monica
sorry.
seems to be rolling her eyeballs a little bit.
No.
You have a very interesting perspective. I mean, we're heavy on St. John, St. Thomas. It would be
No.
interesting.
St. Croix is different. It's entirely
It's
different.
very
experience,
different,
yeah.
and I think you have that strong Puerto Rican Latino influence over there now too with Los
Which I think is
Dominicanos,
another
as
factor.
well as an influx of continentals that were primarily brought down to work at the oil refinery and that sort of thing. So, do you want to speak to that?
And in
a little
some
bit?
respect, in the Virgin Islands economy, there's a divestment in St. Croix. You know, I mean, we've even heard
They're the sacrificial goat.
among circles in St. John and St. Thomas, so St. Croix should just be by itself.
Well,
over
and
there,
some
you
would
know,
say
left
that
alone.
St. Croix is the only one that has really retained a degree of a Creole language that's still
And the culture, they're
and a
out
culture
St. Thomas and St. John
too,
culture is
that's,
disappearing very quickly.
you know, a mix of Danish
Look at
and
the
Spanish and.
I mean, I think just the fluidity of being more metropolitan, St. Thomas, and being a seaport, the language has changed a lot more, where I think some of the older dialect probably has been retained more. I mean, just from what I've heard from some of the old timers that we're good friends with, Tommy Mackay, who would have been great to sit on this panel. He's a, I don't know, third or fourth generation, but the Bergs.
Crucian.
Yeah, the Berg family, who they ran sugar works, but then Tommy's mom was mixed, and he tells a very interesting, not to, you know, get off topic, but really interesting story about how his mother, who was very light-skinned, probably like John Uema's mom, married a Berg, and he died, he was a sailor. So then the brother who owned sugar works would bring her family food every day, and she'd sign off on sugar and whatever have you. And then, long story short, during the time of, I guess it was Hamilton Jackson, and a lot of the labor, you know, all of the contract day when they were fighting and disputing about, you know, increasing wages, people, the Berg family at Sugar Works kicked all of their people off. They said, "Oh yeah, you're gonna protest? You know, go your ass." So then they went. They all headed west, and that's when, you know, there was little scuttles, and, you know, people were doing little acts of resistance, like lighting. No, that was after Fireburn. Fireburn's 1878. This is like 1914. So long story short, right before transfer. So she basically takes in a bunch of her family. So then the Berg guy, her brother-in-law, says, "But you're a Berg. What are you doing? You know, you're not supposed to be mixing." She said, "That's my family." Well, then, you know, all of the things that you signed off on, it's time to pay. And she couldn't, so she had to give up her family house, which was right there in Christiansted, right on the water, across from the old barracks yard. So I just think that I don't really know how I got off topic there, but I think that it's complicated.
I think it is very complicated, and I think,
Slippery
you know,
slope.
to give the floor
Yeah,
to the
racism
ninth
didn't-
senior,
didn't
you know,
just come with the America.
from a historical perspective,
Didn't just come, oh, yeah,
No, it
yeah,
didn't.
yeah, no, yeah, certainly, but, you know, what we know today, it did, and it makes some of the other things seem, I don't know, milder is not the right word, but just easier to accept, understand, you know, live, maybe, perhaps, you know.
What I'm going to say is probably going to get me in trouble, but as my understanding, something that, as you were saying, growing up in town, growing up as a white kid, perceptively in Tutu Valley was a rough place. It was racially pretty bad, especially in the time of my childhood. And I attribute a lot of that, as far as I understand it, because it was told to me by people who had been part of it. The Black Panther movement made a huge move into the Virgin Islands and infiltrated, got positions as educators in the public school system, and just stirred the pot.
And through here
fomented
to the
whole-
rest of the Caribbean.
Exactly.
There were Black Panther rallies in Antigua.
And
And it's
this-
like, what am I doing on it?
We also had a first generation of Virgin Islanders that were going off to the States to go to college too, and got radicalized in the black universities in the United States.
Which triggered.
Which were
Fountain
really the
Valley.
only places they could go to school,
Exactly.
to tell you the truth, because, you know, my aunt, you know, was at the time before her death, she was the last surviving, oldest surviving Howard alumni, right? But she was clear skinned like me, you know, but she was perceived as black in the States, and that was her only real choice. You know, if she had gone anywhere else, she would have just been persecuted, basically, and not gotten the education that she got, and she came back and shared that as an educator, you know. So I think you're right, and I think, you know, different places geographically on the island, you know, living, and I mean, back when I was a kid, there were really no East End, there was no Peterborough, there was no Mahogany Run on.
You didn't go to,
You know, but
nobody
there was
wanted-
North Side and the polarization of the white continental to light skin color, and that became kind of the suburbia, the white suburbia, and then and that was lower middle class, working class, middle class, you know, white people that moved there.
Those are the same
Then
guys,
enter the
man.
millionaires and the East End and some of that, and now they're getting called crackers by the white billionaires that are coming down, which is kind of interesting, and I love that because, you know, I got persecuted at the yacht club. I wasn't a member, but I competed there with tennis, and, you know, coming from town to East End, to that enclave, man, you got it. You got licked, you know, on the other side. So put the white Creole person in context, right? And they got nailed from both sides. You know, I got nailed from both sides, but, you know, I had an inner strength because I had a lot of knowledge about the island. You know, yeah, I grew up with this black elitism type of thing, which really is kind of my core, like, you know, like Ms. Gibney was saying here, you know, is, you know, I think throughout my whole upbringing, I felt like a black person, you know, that's how I felt those sensitivities. And as I broke away from my family safety net, and, you know, by desire, and got on the streets, things got really revealed to me, you know, and I learned a lot more than, you know, and, you know, as young adults or whatever, with my brother and I, there's some different dichotomies, you know, that I moved back to town, and my brother moved, you know, inside a gate in a white enclave, and married a white continental, you know, and the isolation that brings, you know, to the realities of some of the hardships that the young Virgin Islanders are having today, and again, more along economic means than anything in terms of identity. It's really, you know, really interesting. And you know, I met a client. She ended up becoming a client. I met a girl and we were talking, and she asked me a real perplexing question about, must be about 10 years ago now. And she said, and she was Dominican, mixed Dominican, and she said, do you subscribe to the struggle? And I was like, holy crap, that's a real challenging question for me,
Yeah,
because
that's the word that you subscribe.
yeah, right.
You
subscribe,
asked for it to come in the mail.
Right. It was. I was like, and she was a Dominican living in New York who probably went through her own struggle, but she was also a Blanquita that was able to get assimilated into that American construct, whereas you live the struggle of the Caribbean has many struggles still, you know, and being one, I was like, well, I inherited it, you know, I didn't subscribe to it. Now, what has happened since then, by intention, is I've unsubscribed, you know, to that by intent, and I realized, you know, the whole law of the universe thing, you know, which came a little late, but then I'm a man, and then that's a long story. But, so interesting differences, I think, geographically, and how the island has grown into, I mean, a friend of mine from Jamaica that, is a Creole Jamaican that still has kind of a Creole identity going on, is perplexed by, and he claims that St. Thomas alone, not including St. Croix, because I know you have your own groups, there's 25 different St. Thomases happening at the same time. And I think that really is, you can get subjected to a lot of different things being a white local, or for this case white Creole, being in the mix, because you get a crossfire and you see a lot of things that you wouldn't as a black Virgin Islander or as just a white continental. You see a lot of things, and then enter any type of experience in America, particularly if it was in the South.
What's the struggle? What's the struggle?
It's just
What is the
the
struggle
struggle is
you're
what is how you Frenchies earn their stripes. It's just living,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
living the hard life.
Yeah.
It's having to live hand to mouth and not having money in the bank to boost you up, and being able to inherit money and being able to put your kids through college.
And we didn't really live in a struggle per se that our parents
Our parents
dealt with. They really lived in a struggle, but we're our parents' children, and we're of the place that was a struggle. There was a lot of struggles. There was slavery, there was piracy, there was hurricanes, there was economic divestment. There were colonial transfers, and new colonial nationalisms, and a lot of different things that made us. And I think, to me, the last question is the most interesting one moving forward, because I think that we'll all have kind of a little different bent on that in terms of ideal things for yourself, because even though we share kind of a common skin tone here, we've all had these very experiences in relationship to our skin tone. And
You comment, there's, your friend saying there's 25 different St. Thomases going on, Number one, before I say that, the struggle, okay? We still live in a colonial context, okay?
thus the struggle.
And one of the things that's common amongst, I think, everybody here is that we relate to ourselves as being island people or Caribbean people, but not United States citizens first. Okay. Not first, right? So that's our struggle. We live in a colonial context, and all of us carry U.S. passports and are United States citizens, but we don't relate to it. Okay, so that's our basic struggle, I think. Okay. The other thing about being 25 different St. Thomases, clearly one of the reasons why we are still in that struggle and why we are still in a colonial situation is that we don't have a common sense of identity as a Virgin Island people. And one of the reasons why that doesn't exist is that when you are in a place that is a nation of immigrants, and these islands have historically been a nation of immigrants, okay, because they've always been a colony. The way a colonial power retains control is make sure that the Creole people, the local people, never coalesce and form a distinct identity that becomes nationalism, that spurs nationalism, and then overthrows the colony, okay? So this is colonialism 101.
Right.
One of the ways you
William
keep
Lynch.
that dynamic
Social
is
categories.
you keep bringing people in, and displace or minimize the power of the Creole, native, local, whatever you want to call it. And we are still going today. The way, while people might say they feel like they are Virgin Islanders, the only way that they can find some sense of identity amongst themselves is within their own peer groups. And those peer groups basically break down to either America or individual islands within the Caribbean, okay? So you have your Antiguan contingent, you've got your Dominican contingent, you got your Dominicanos, you have your Puerto Ricanos, people who identify, maybe first as a Virgin Islander if they are local or Creole, okay. Secondly, they identify as Down Islanders, Nevetians, Kititians, whatever, okay? and then somewhere out on that periphery is America. You know?
I need to interject, and I might be vilified in this group, but in, in regards to America, I do have to say, and I say this because I've been, writing my grandmother's eulogy and reflecting on her life and that experience, it's easy to romanticize what St. Thomas was in the 40s and 50s. But the fact of the matter is that woman had a dirt poor, hard life. I mean, hard, like none of us at this table can understand. And for my grandfather, at 13, he jumped on a boat from St. Bart's as a stowaway and came to a land where he knew no one and raised 13 children on his own. And I'm just saying that we are who, like, I was able to get an education, a college education in a private school, Catholic school, because of some of the privileges America brought to us. And my grandmother growing up with all those brothers and sisters, one wooden shack smaller than this room, and you go to bed hungry, or you eat boiled green sugar apple for dinner. And it's a joke that we have that lobster is poor people food. It's a joke, but there was a point where we ate lobster, but it's because that's what you caught yourself, and it's a joke that these continentals will pay so much for it, because that's lobster is like hand to mouth. The old wife that you caught, that's hand to mouth, and if the sea is rough, you're not eating dinner that night.
You better have some chicken.
Or you kill your goat that you raised. I'm just saying that time was rough and painful, and the pain that my grandmother lived with, I will never forget those stories. I'll never forget how she suffered. And my parents too. My parents had a hard life. And for us to be able to have an education is huge. And so there's mixed blessings that come.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. Because
If we would view America differently, if we weren't getting all the stupid people coming here. And that's what's happening. I'm telling you.
We get the rejects. They can't handle it up there, so.
But it's not just.
Not all of them. I mean, again,
right.
we all have
Yeah.
parents
Right.
that came down from the
Yeah.
continental United States
My people
that
are
were
running.
able to assimilate
dad,
and integrate
Right.
and work the land.
Right.
I mean, my dad worked right here in Tutu, and he, the cow manure,
Priscilla,
but I think the new people, the tourist trade, I think that we have fallen into.
Right, and a big part of that.
Sea pirates.
If you look at the tourism in, say, Barbados or Cayman Islands or, Beckway, St. Bart's, when you meet Americans, they're like, cool, you can have a conversation, they're educated. People that come here are part of our economies, just to keep the economy going.
Oh,
They don't care who comes
We
here.
sold out.
Yeah, they don't
We
care
went
who
for
comes
quantity
here.
versus
Yeah, but you
quality.
see, in those other islands right now, they all have a sense of place and national identity.
Right.
Okay?
And they have
their
laws.
own immigration laws.
Right.
And they have
Our
laws
biggest
to protect.
problem
We
is
don't
you
make our
can send
laws.
the dumbest ass tourists from the United States, they all come down here, they see it, and they want to live here, and they want to stay.
and they can.
And they feel, we're in America, we're Americans, this is our place, we live here.
Well, it's the Jimmy
You know?
Buffett, no pun
And they've got
intended,
more
with the new Jimmy
privilege than
Buffett,
we
but
do.
it's that
Yeah, and they end
mentality.
up with
Right.
more privilege.
Well,
No
You know,
passport
having-
required.
Yeah, exactly.
Having romantic notions
We
of what
stole
it
that
is
from
like
that.
to live on a Caribbean island, Pirates of the Caribbean, or the Jimmy Buffett.
He sells a
Fucking North
lifestyle.
Carolina.
I photographed Jimmy Buffett a couple of weeks ago. Yeah,
Now this is where St. Croix is much different, guys.
It is. It's
And their bay
Need
is on
another
a list
fire.
of polluted bays where you can't swim.
right.
Yeah, I think St. Croix has been a little more jealous about allowing for these fringes to, take over, essentially.
Well, there's
Good
more,
and bad.
I think that there's been more,
She's a little
obviously, a
jealous.
spirit of resistance, and that comes from what you're talking about you know, as bad as Fountain Valley Massacre and all that, at least there was a Black consciousness movement.
Exactly.
Where I got Caribbean history from the 4th grade up. Uta Baruka was coming regularly,
Yeah,
so
I'm
Columbus
sure.
was called Columbusas.
Explain that for the record.
Yeah.
Because it's not something that.
Muta Baruka.
No, Fountain Valley or the difference between St. Croix and
So, well, I mean, I think that there was definitely a very Black radical movement. Mario Moorhead, I dated his
Rastafarianism.
nephew. Chris Moorhead was my childhood sweetheart. So I had all of Mario's collection of books as a young person, like, 16. And I was reading them with, his notes were still in them. And all his Frantz Fanon books and whatever have you. But I think the Fountain Valley thing was a bunch of crazy guys, and there's a combination of elements. Some of them were, Vietnam vets that were put on the front line and experienced racism at its harshest, Black men getting killed, the first ones killed, and then coming back to St. Croix and realizing that economic changes have gotten worse. And here they are serving their country, but they're treated as, second-class citizens. So that mixed in with, crack cocaine was probably up in the mix.
Well, at the backbone
No,
of psychology of
I don't think
agrarian
there
There
culture
was some that
versus
had permeated
cosmopolitanism.
in the
and merchants.
in the
I don't-
early
I don't-
80s.
Hold on,
History is the
nobody-
history of resistance.
Yeah.
It's where
Yeah, back to history. There you go. 1733.
the labor riots.
Absolutely.
Cape
Cape Arrows. Let's start with Columbus's first man slaughtered by it.
When did
Taino.
When
So
was
it's a very
crack
different
first produced?
Very,
developed?
very.
Geography, man.
Which I think is a good valid point to make for people who don't understand the dynamics or know about the Virgin Islands, that not only are we unique within each island, we're a territory of four, if you count Water Island, distinct
count Water
cultures and
Can't
experiences,
count Water Island.
So that alone creates a very different dynamic that St. Croix, even within St. Croix, you have Frederiksted and Christiansted, and their experiences are very different. And then, St. John being much smaller and insular also has a different experience.
You're right. And although we wanted tourism, there's been a major resistance to, we don't want cruise ships. We don't want that type of, bottom
Selling
feeders. If you're going to bring in cruise ships, can we get like the really small ones that only go to like St. Martin and St. Barts?
They promote tourists instead of the traveler, and that's something about the inclusion of being under an American flag too. There's a lot of dichotomies there. If you answer the question in terms of privilege, being white, I would say as a Virgin Islander, no, I did not have. I don't feel like I have any privilege being white as a Virgin Islander, but as a white American, I would say yes, and more so in America, but somewhat equivocated to how you're perceived by the EDC and the white business person that's investing here now. They're like, oh, when I tell them I'm a local, they're like perplexed by that, and then, however, civically, which is my heritage, my grandfather was a senator, my families were educators, I felt ostracized by my own people for wanting to get involved because I'm bringing a challenging perspective by my own right of traveling and everything. And then, so it really kind of comes down to the choices the white Creole makes amidst the Black community. And, is also, in our case, subjected to American racial scenarios that have just really rocked me to the core in both places, in the Virgin Islands and in America subsequently. And in the VI, and this is getting to what David Senior was saying, in the VI, there are no real structures or networks for the local person except the government. And it can be exclusionary at times, or more so at times. And along racial perceptions, And so, what I say to them is just don't judge a white man by his color. Because those same shitty-ass tourists that are coming here now, but if you look at my father who came and moved into a Black compound, kind of a pioneer almost in a way, that came here to escape the crap of America's suburban stuff maybe his own family, who knows, but those people were coming here for different reasons. They just didn't come here and get romanticized, fall in love with the island, and they suffered, and then you start looking at, well, what is a local? You know, to me, in modern times, I'd say anyone that's stuck around after a hurricane, because you see all these things boil, you know, come to the surface and boil, you know, at this, you know, so it's festering, it's still here. You know, I wonder about the young, you know, kids that are coming up. I wonder about my own family, my niece, and, you know, my own children when they happen, as to what are they going to, what am I going to be able to retain, you know, and transfer to them in terms of the art of domestication, because it just seems that, you know, it gets more and more diluted. Now, the beauty of it is the world is getting more and more homogenized. You know, the world is becoming creolization, if you want. But the defaults are really harsh, you know, racial realities. And
I have to apologize.
As one of the last remaining colonies
because
on the
that's where
planet,
drugs were involved.
I think we're having a
It was like I
much
was confused
harder
as to
time
when crack
facing
happened,
the issues of
Late 70s,
globalization.
early 80s, yeah.
Because at least other nations around the world who are facing globalization are facing it with a national identity, an identity of place, okay? We still have this ambiguity, okay? And we're just getting thrown in with America and being overrun by globalization.
and we've
in the
just
American-
jumped, we've thrown
in the
ourselves
American
into the
standpoint.
American thing.
But do you think actually having a national identity is so important to move forward?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
To a degree, I
To a
think.
degree.
Yes, we can't
Only
control
because,
our own
only because
immigration.
we're disenfranchised.
I don't agree.
Yeah.
Well,
The reason being is because there are people that have moved to the U.S. from Russia. There are people who are, you know, moved from, and they've done fine. You know, I find that in the Virgin Islands, we're not evolving, man.
The problem-
People are still having kids. They're having 4 or 5 kids. In today's social media, today's politics, no one's standing up to the podium and saying maybe it's not a good idea to have 4 or 5 kids. If you want better tourists, you want the sea dream to pull up, you want to get rid of Margaritaville, we need better people on this island that can take care of better tourists. We don't have that. People are not evolving. They're making the same mistakes that people were making 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago when they were struggling. We need to evolve. We're not. We're not.
But you see, we've
Hey, look,
turned
I come-
over, we've rolled over, you know.
I mean, I think this best exemplifies why St. Croix has been able to retain the modicum of identity that it has, because they didn't want to go into the tourism trade. They wanted to stay agricultural. This was 66.
We want sugar,
Election
not no
66.
pie.
Yeah.
They want Paiwanski
Taiwan.
Oh.
because it was forced on them.
Right.
It's a great show.
I was who was governor at the time.
Right.
We need to
The
keep.
challenge, though, is that even though St. Croix has kept a stronger degree of identity, they're still the most economically
I think
deprived and depressed island of all three of the Virgin Islands.
Let's get back to
So,
Paiwan. there.
St. John is
Wow.
there.
But they
to
also
Alan's
added to
point,
our
does
economy the
identity
most.
really
I don't know if it-
foster more prosperity?
Yeah, let us not lie about that shit. See, we
Once
lie.
we lost
Yes.
that diversity,
you do.
Yeah.
oh, we have that was true.
Lisa has to go shortly.
Okay,
So I think actually we should probably wrap this up because we've been talking for almost 3.5 hours now
Yeah.
at this point.
I'm a sucker.
And this has to be something that Annalee listens to and she can edit or put on.
We
her
didn't
website
have any
if
of the
she wants.
stories of being
You
made
need
fun
to
of
come.
growing up.
Yes.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
and
Visit us?
she may listen to
I'm
this
so
and may
mad.
want us to come
You can have
together
my
again and
Exactly.
hash
I think-
out some
I
other
think
I
we
think
all
it's really
should
needed.
start, it
I
should
really
be a
appreciate-
continuous kind of thing, even if it's something that all of this group doesn't get together, there should be some kind, and it doesn't necessarily have to be white, it
Exactly.
needs to
We
be
need
a
to integrate
conversation
more people
about,
into it as well.
Well, I think we need to
Virgin
really
Islands
answer the
equality.
last question, though, as
the
closure.
community needs to step
The
up.
humor stuff, we all know the humor stuff. Now, that might be something that she wants in her presentation, and maybe we could write it in or
It's
something.
funny. It's good.
It is funny. I
That's-
mean, we could, maybe after Elisa leaves, we could laugh about it, but I think that, no, I mean, I think
Let's
you
not
should
take
answer the
ourselves
last
so
question.
seriously.
I think you should answer the last question, because I think that that's really a pertinent one.
or whatever
in terms
thoughts
of-
you might have, Alyssa, given the discussion.
I'm sorry, I have to take
Yeah.
my kids to soccer.
She's a soccer
I
mom.
need to get back home.
She's a white Creole soccer mom.
The last question is, what makes you feel you belong or don't belong?
No, it isn't.
No, it
No, it
isn't.
isn't.
Oh, it isn't? I'm sorry.
No.
It's on my page.
What does the ideal Virgin Island
How
society
do you
and racial...
envision the future of racial identity?
No.
What does an ideal Virgin Island society
Right.
in
in racial terms look like to you? And what can you do or are doing to make it an ideal reality? And how do you envision the future of racial identity in Virgin Islands? I think that's really the crux of, what, and I think we're going to find some interesting things about
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I find race to be so, like the conversation of race so destructive. There's nothing unifying about talking about black versus white. It's inherently divisive, and I would like for us to continue to have a degree of color blindness, and for those people that come here that are not, they need to learn how to be colorblind or reconsider their choices. I do think America has done a lot for this island, good and bad, destructively and positively, and Virgin Islanders need to be clear about what it is that they want next. I'm not sure that I know exactly what that would be, but what it should not be is black versus white. So,
Thank you, Lisa.
Good
answer
one.
your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. If you have to leave, thank you very much for
Sorry.
participating.
Yes. Thank you.
We're just going to wrap up now, so you're not going to be missing much. But
Which,
really, I don't think we can decide on that.
Go around the table with
I think
this
we
last
just
question.
wanna-
Fairly, it'll probably be another hour and 2 hours or 3 hours.
I'll probably go home with mom.
No, I think this is
It's
a
a
good,
great
it's a
topic.
good,
Like
good,
one
an-
that
and,
we
a good and a
talk
good answer because it's all moot if you're not talking about the future.
Let's go around the table with that one.
So are we going
This
this
is
way?
like
I don't know.
Um, What's What's the ideal Virgin Island society regarding race and whatnot? I think when you look at it, the Virgin Islands broken down into 4 races. Black, you're gonna have the local race, which could be mulattoes, could be Frenchies, it could be, I would consider you like not white, but part of, so I would say locals, blacks, Hispanics, and then whites from the States. And how would it become a better society? Just respect each other. That's
There you
it.
go.
End of story.
Everyone's
Simple.
mixed.
Don't look down, don't disrespect, and just be cool. That's it. You can't force anybody to like somebody else and whatnot, but just respect them. That's it. And that's pretty simple in a nutshell.
There you go.
Good.
Yeah, I agree 100%. But I need to say that when we talk about people, accepting people within our society that have a degree of colorblindness or that try their best to be as inclusive of everyone and respect everybody as possible, that kind of insinuation that the people who are coming here that are not being that way are all Americans, and I disagree with that. Because I think we have a lot of racism being imported from the rest of the Caribbean and other places as well. Okay? And right now, I think more than ever before, there is a sense of empowerment within the Black West Indian community, particularly those that have been here for a generation or two. And as someone who identifies as a white Virgin Islander, I really resent it when I get lumped in the category of just all them continentals,
All the white people.
by people who haven't been in the Virgin Islands
to-
and have
to
less
even know the
family heritage in the
difference, to
Virgin
even know
Islands
the
than I do.
difference.
Okay? So it makes it very hard for me not to some degree, break people down into categories and be resistant to, I don't like to see racism. I don't like to see people being exclusionary on any side. I think if we are to create a better society in the Virgin Islands, it's got to be an inclusive society. And I think one of the ways that we can have that kind of society is to help develop a sense of Virgin Islandness. And promote it.
Part of the reason
promote it across all races.
If we were
and
able
groups
to
of
pass the
people.
Organic Act and have the Constitutional Convention go with what we had actually already written,
Yeah.
a lot of these issues would have started to clear up.
I agree.
Or modify.
Or modify at least how we think
We
about it.
definitely need to ditch the Organic Act, and we need to somehow break free from the Department of Interior making all
Yes,
that.
Yeah.
because
Well,
they're
we-
not allowing us to do it.
I'm not I'm not professing independence or just a stronger sense of place.
Well, a degree of autonomy, because I think we have less autonomy than some states within the continental United States. So some degree of self-determination and autonomy, I think, is to what you're...
Well, you know,
speaking to.
our constitutional convention, i.e. the ability to rewrite the Organic Act, has never been marketed. We don't even understand that we have that ability as a society. You know?
And one of the problems is that we have this constant influx of people, particularly from the British Caribbean, coming in that have a totally different history, a totally different concept, don't understand our issues with America.
At all.
At all.
At all.
You know? And now they're not, you know, when we were coming up, when I was coming up, they were a minor portion of the population. When you were coming up, they were your schoolmates and they were going off to college.
Yeah, one
And
generation.
now there are senators and
Right.
our commissioners,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and our governors for that sense.
Right. Yeah. The ideal Virgin Islands society, to me, I think, foremost is this is black and white, that we need to move away from a ghetto, you know, kind of American mentality, you know. I would love to see it harmoniously integrated with every sector being representing and expressing themselves and augmenting to our unique milieu, you know, so that we can exploit it, you know, and actually reap some benefits of some of our, you know, birthright, really. And what do I do to kind of add to that is playing African percussion. That breaks a lot of barriers, you know, breaks barriers of preconceptions, it breaks barriers of the conception and of misconceptions. So I think what we can do what we can do is identify with something, anything other than the American, you know, construct before we assimilate into extinction, because that's kind of where we're heading if we continue along the same path.
Okay. I think I want to talk about it in more in terms of not really racial terms, but more from a cultural perspective, and thinking that we need to live inside and against. And what I mean by that is operating from the inside, but still pushing up against the system and creating our own histories. So, you know, there's no talking about the Caribbean from the U.S., but we need to kind of be living in this geography, talking about it, because there's been a lot of history that hasn't been told, and as an artist and a lover of culture and history, you know, when I search the archive for images of any types of African expression, whether it's non-material culture or, you know, dance, bambula, it's very limited. There's like nothing. So I think what needs to happen now is we need to be producing our own histories and our own narratives, whether that's as artists or whether that's as historians, kind of unearthing some of these stories that haven't been told.
Thank you. Larry?
As far as what do I think the future, or what ideally the reality should be, well, I gotta say I don't know. But I do think that
That's okay.
we should have education, and basically what Alan was saying, you just need to respect, but you're only going to get the respect through education and awareness, and that goes to what Monica
And through people not isolating themselves. Right. Because, I mean, there's some rich, interesting, I mean, the Haitians, you know, are totally isolated. I mean, man, musically, culturally, some of the resistance that they've had historically, some of the subjectiveness to America and France that they've had to deal with, you know, and sharing those things with us, you know, and other than the fact that they're phenotypically, you know, a different mix in the Caribbean as you get to that area, Hispaniola and Cuba, you know, you're getting a total different African mix than we've had in the smaller islands. And so that's how you gain the respect. You know, you can't stay isolated and say, you know, I'm a Dominican, I'm a respect. Everyone here respect. And then that's just, we just adopted that out of the ghetto thing, respect. You know, that's out of rap music and all this crap. And if we really could understand our uniqueness as a Creole culture or even as a black culture and how much we've contributed even to world history. You know, we don't even understand those things, and that's how we're going to get respect.
Right.
You know, we have to respect ourselves first before just people are just going to respect others and gain respect. You know, because tourism's a rough industry. You know, it kills folk culture, it kills vernacular architecture, it kills the environment, and it can even kill tourists if you're not careful.
Right.
You know?
I want to clarify that when I said respect, I didn't mean it in the rap reference to.
No.
But more,
it's used as a term.
Right. Well, I meant it more in
deserving.
terms of have people, especially people who come from outside to a new place, have some sort of consideration for the fact that we do perhaps have our own way of doing things and our own culture instead of because I see a lot of people that come in and their initial reaction is, oh, I know better, and I'm going to impose my way of doing things and my way of thinking on you, and that's something that we have suffered.
Well, getting back to what she's saying, you know, we're pretty much a submissive people, you know, because even though we've had resistance against Denmark, like someone said, you know, like you said, it's a small group. America is not a small group, you know, and so we've just kind of folded. We've just folded, you know, we have a history of resistance, but we just folded against America because America is perceived as a superpower, or is a superpower, and, you know, don't mess with Texas. You know, we even have a Texas society here that's stronger than local Virgin Islanders. And it's like, what?
So what I would say
doing,
is
you know?
that also in the same respect, that we should not be as accepting of, say, like our public officials and the things that they do and our lawmakers, and because I have people that tell me, like, if, you know, from especially most recently St. Lucian, if the stuff that happened in government here happened there, they would be in the streets. They would be lynching. them.
People getting their heads chopped.
And we're being cross-colonized.
Right.
Because of Americans' open policy,
Right.
we're not just being colonized by America,
Right.
you know?
But you know why it's allowed, right? It's because it's such a large percentage of people are employed by the government.
Well,
So-
also,
And they need more people. And now, how many more people? How much bigger a government do we need now to keep the government retirees system?
Matthew, would you like to share?
For ideal Virgin Island society, in racial terms, I think we all pretty much touched on the same thing. It comes down to respect. It also comes down to the fact that we are not, as Virgin Islanders, this place has never been accepted into Western society. We are pushed up on the periphery of Western society. We are a tourist destination for them. We are not part of the metropole. We are the peripheral. We're the beach on the side that they come and they visit. So what if the people who live there, they got our beach, you know, it doesn't matter, whatever. We need to get past Western episteme, Western ways of thought. We need to change our minds. We need to get more into our resistance, like Rastafarianism and stuff like that. Those mindsets and the things that they do for people and their mind and how they think is invaluable to what needs to happen with, whether it be if we want to move towards a colorblind society or just a color conscious society where we have respect, but we understand our differences and we just live with our differences and it's okay, you know. That's what it looks like. To me, it looks like us fixing our economy, but not in the sense of what we think we need to provide for our people. Food, we don't provide any food for our people. We don't provide education for our people. We don't provide housing for our people. We don't provide anything. We expect everything to be given to us from the states, and that's a huge problem, and we have to move past that.
We don't provide social infrastructure.
Yeah, there's no infrastructure for our people to live down here. We don't have it. And what I'm doing, I'm building a farm, and I plan to sell chickens, organic chickens, fruits and vegetables, stuff like that. And I'm having a baby
Thank you,
and teaching
Matthew.
him right.
David, you have some
Yeah,
closing
I
words?
guess I can, it won't be much because I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think the first step that we can really do that's practical, and I think that comes out of this dialogue is more openness, more sharing, and not being afraid to share amongst ourselves. And that's broader than this group or this identity group as white Creoles or whatever identity we decided. Bring in all kinds of Virgin Islanders and have these same discussions. And I think somebody told me one time that with openness and without fear of being judged. And I think somebody said to me that people tend to treat culture like a butterfly sometimes. Oh, you got to protect it, you put it in a jar, but then you end up with a dead butterfly. Culture's got to be open to change and to sharing and to all kinds of cross-cultural things. So if we can get to a place somehow where we can do that better in the Virgin Islands, I think that would. I'm coming from a very kind of like skeptical mindset of all that because of my St. John experience, and I'm so distressed by everything that's happened there and how we just failed at every level to even remotely try to do that. And that those failures come from many different places. And I think that just being more open and just having these dialogues in a more visible way is maybe a first step to some sort of improvement.
Yeah, thanks. I concur with David and a lot of the comments that have been shared here. I think that I would like to see a Virgin Islands that's a little more self-autonomous with a degree of identity that is not exclusionary. And to have more, I think the key is education and being able to have these open discussions. In this case, this was a little exclusionary because we were talking or trying to explore the idea of white Creole. But I think moving forward, I think it's important that we become more, inclusive as a society and educate people about our history on all three islands. And I think that using the creative arts and our talents as photographers, as architects, as filmmakers, as writers, that we can maybe communicate in a way that is less, a little less threatening as a society, and maybe use this forum that we have just had to expand on these thoughts and these ideas and maybe come up with creative, artistic ways of educating and communicating our challenges here in the Virgin Islands as it relates to race and class and economics and the environment and all the things that we've spoken about that have impacted us in a negative way. Thank you
Yes,
for
thank you.
everybody participating,
Thank you,
and thank
guys.
you for Annalee Davis for allowing us the opportunity to explore these ideas and these issues and as it relates to the Virgin Islands and then the greater Caribbean and globally.
Thank you, Annalee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annalee.